Welcome back to Transcriber from Reddit. Today's topic, crossing over with games denominations play, actually comes from the LCMS Concordia University Report 2024. That's right, I am transcribing the whole report. Why? Because I like punishing myself. Plus, I thought there were a couple things that I really found interesting in the report. I understand if most of you don't find this as interesting as I do. I initially read it with the intent of finding out the religious details, especially which was being reported on in the ex-Lutheran subreddit. But I also found some of the financial details interesting. Shout out to my partner who suggested that I look at the financials because, as he says, financials tell everything. Before I begin reading, I'm going to cover some acronyms that are commonly used in this report. They don't always address the acronyms at the same time as they use the acronyms, so I'm going to address it here. LCMS stands for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Concordia University, Wisconsin is shortened to CUW. That starts on page 6. Lutheran Identity and Mission Outcome Standards, otherwise known as LIMOS, is first referenced on page 12. Concordia University, Ann Arbor is known as the acronym CUAA, or Ann Arbor. That first starts on page 5. Concordia University System, which, by the way, denotes all Concordia universities as a whole, that's shortened to CUS, and that first starts on page 8. Or at least is first elaborated on in page 8. Page 2 reads as follows. Concordia University, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor is a Lutheran higher education community committed to helping students develop in mind, body, and spirit for service to Christ in the church and the world. Note that the words mind, body, and the word spirit are all highlighted in yellow. Moving on to page 3, table of contents. I'm not going to read everything on here. What I will read are the headings for the general topics covered here. We start with executive summary on page 5. Then there's the introduction on page 6. Then there's the task force composition and process on page 7. Then there's the task force conclusions on page 8. Overall, that covers pages 8 through 11, with the conclusion on page 11. The accreditation subcommittee report is on page 12. Overall, that section runs from pages 12 through 16. Then there's the finance subcommittee report on page 17. Overall, that report covers pages 17 through 20. Then we have the Property and Legal Subcommittee report on page 26. Overall, that report covers pages 26 through 27. We have the Mission Subcommittee report, which starts at page 28, and it covers pages 28 through, there's no page 2, 28 through 31. That is it for the table of contents here. We move on to page 4. CUAA Task Force Report. As I said before, CUAA is short for Concordia University, Ann Arbor. This is the Ann Arbor campus located up in Michigan. 2. The Board of Regents of Concordia University, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor. From the task force constituted pursuant to the board's February 29, 2024 resolution. RE, process to establish Concordia University, Ann Arbor as a separately accredited institution of higher education. Date, May 31st, 2024. Starting with executive summary on page 5. In order to establish Concordia University Ann Arbor, parentheses, hereafter, quote, CUAA, end quote, end parentheses, as an independent higher educational institution, the following steps would be required. 1. Accreditation. CUAA would first establish a governing board, adopt basic institutional policies, and demonstrate 2 years of stable finances. Upon satisfying that requirement, it would engage in a 3 to 5 year process to build out administration and software infrastructure, satisfy HLC accreditation, and, quote, change of control, end quote, requirements, and navigate Synod bylaws, which do not clearly address this situation. I do apologize. As of recording this, I forgot to mention the acronym HLC, which stands for Higher Learning Commission. That first gets fully fleshed out on page 12, and unfortunately, I did not add it to my initial list of acronyms on the first page. Please note that I will put all acronyms in the main body, the description to this video for all listeners/viewers of this video. I continue reading. Point 2, financial. Raise a minimum of an additional $31.8 million to balance the CUAA budget for the fiscal years 25 through 27 during the process of separation. Parentheses, this figure assumes a 3-year, not a 5-year process, and does not include any cost to meet the a priori requirement of 2 years of stable finances, end parentheses. Side note, the a priori words are italicized here. I continue reading. Develop a financial plan to increase revenue, decrease costs, and significantly increase gifts to cover the shortfall between income and expenses and fund ongoing operations. Point 3. Legal. Secure approval of the LCMS Board of Directors. Negotiate a land contract sale to the new corporate entity for CUAA. And clarify the lease to the Michigan District for its office. Point 4. Lutheran identity and mission outcomes. Strengthen understanding of what is a distinct Lutheran identity to enhance what is now more in the nature of a general Christian identity. Next section. The major challenges to such an undertaking would be: Point 1. Accreditation. Meeting prerequisites to apply for accreditation, including having a governing board and policies, as well as the 2-year financial stability requirement, developing administration and software infrastructure, and navigating Synod bylaws. Point 2. Financial. Addressing campus physical plant needs in addition to other expenses. Covering cost of athletic programs, identifying realistic, reliable sources of increased revenue, and reducing costs. Point 3. Legal. Dealing with the Michigan District lease and the main campus reversionary clause, seeking approval by Synod's Board of Directors. Point 4. Lutheran identity and mission outcomes. Maintaining focus on Lutheran identity when establishing new administration and Board of Regents, working with a student population which contains a high percentage of students who are not from LCMS congregations. Side note, I have words here that read must change them over because this is important when I go to mention this later on. Lutheran identity and mission outcomes is mentioned quite frequently in this report, as well as their ideas of what would make the campus more Lutheran. I want you to keep this in mind as they later discuss the number of Christians versus the number of Lutherans that are on the campus. I continue reading. The next section. The major risks or unknown factors of such an undertaking would be: Point 1. Accreditation. Whether the HLC would approve separate accreditation, parentheses, as well as other required accreditors and state regulators, end parentheses. Whether the separation process can fit within Synod's bylaws. Point 2. Financial. The impact on enrollment of tuition increases. The ability to generate substantially greater gifts to the university than at present. Point 3. Legal. The ability to renegotiate the lease with the Michigan district and the reversionary clause in the deed to the main campus, securing approval of the LCMS's board of directors. Point 4. Lutheran identity and mission outcomes. None identified. Side note. Yes, I have another note here on screen that reads, just gotta convince them all. Also, I do want to say it is very, very weird that you don't have risks or unknown factors when you later talk about in your report about the percentage of students on campus that are Christian versus specifically Lutheran versus specifically LCMS Lutheran. And you talk about how there's not enough Lutherans on campus and how the campus's identity isn't strictly Lutheran, specifically LCMS Lutheran enough. And you can't think enough outside your box to think, oh, these are the risks or unknown factors. Nope, none at all. Nothing to see here. Everything will be A-okay. Sounds exactly like a congregational report. Sounds exactly like a denominational report. Anyway, moving on to the introduction on page 6. Section: History of CUAA's integration with Concordia University, Wisconsin. 10 years ago, Concordia University Ann Arbor found itself in an extremely difficult position. Its enrollment and financial challenges would likely lead to closure. A fortuitous airport meeting between then-President Patrick Ferry and then-President Thomas Alsmeyer prompted discussions about a merger between CUW and CUAA. Encouraged by the leaders of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, who sought the best for their universities, fruitful discussions between CUW and CUAA witnessed both collaboration and demonstrable generosity. These discussions resulted in a merger between CUW and CUAA. At that point, CUW was flourishing with its patent formula for success, which included robust recruitment/enrollments in stable programs, new degrees, and financially healthy operations supported by growing endowments and investments. To help CUAA, CUW's leadership planned to replicate the relative success of its, quote, center model, end quote, for post-traditional learners in Michigan. The university's leadership believed that, within 4 years, the CUAA campus could generate enough revenue to be profitable. The Board of Regents also planned to review the partnership each year if the Ann Arbor campus lost 8% or more each fiscal year. Section: Divergence of actual performance from initial assumptions. Unfortunately, 2 factors complicated the financial dimension of this partnership. Across the United States, the, quote, center model, unquote, began to be replaced with online learning, and CUW's own enrollment began to slowly decline as Wisconsin's demographics began to change. The result was that CUAA could not generate enough revenue to be self-sustaining, and CUW did not have excess revenue to share with CUAA. The university pivoted to enact an alternative plan. CUAA would expand its athletic programs and recruit more athletes to the campus. While that strategy grew the traditional undergraduate enrollment, it also significantly raised operational costs for the campus, to the point that the campus now spends every dollar it generates in revenue. Side note: remember that emphasis on athletics and the drive to get more athletes to campus in order to generate more revenue, because that becomes relevant later, especially when they get to LIMOS designs for the campus. Next section, ongoing structural deficits in finances. Over the past 10 years, the financial position of Concordia University, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor, parentheses, hereafter, quote, CUWAA, end quote, and parentheses, from the perspective of its audits, has remained relatively strong. At the same time, decline in post-traditional enrollment across the university and traditional undergraduate enrollment in Wisconsin have led to rising challenges with the university's cash position. In fact, this past year, the university's structural deficit rose to $9 million. During the past decade, the university has contributed $90 million to operations and capital improvements for the Ann Arbor campus. Each year for the past 10 years, the Ann Arbor campus has experienced a $4 to $5 million operational deficit. The only exception was 1 year, during which the university sold some property on the edge of the Ann Arbor campus. Next section. The CFO colleague report expresses doubt that a sustainable financial model can be developed for CUAA. In a report dated February 1st, 2024, CFO colleague, a financial consultancy for higher education institutions, analyzed recent financial performance for the university and concluded, I'm going to quote this next part here that is on screen seen as italicized. The structural deficit for the combined entity of CUW and CUAA requires immediate and substantial attention. It is there's some text missing because it does ... to the next sentence, which is, it is difficult to see a way forward for CUAA, given its enormous deferred maintenance needs, inadequate NTR per student, and the use of net tuition to fund athletic costs. ... The time is now to craft a multi-year plan that addresses these clear challenges. Side note, I'm from the Wells, not the LCMS, so I apologize if I sound very out of touch with the LCMS, because I am. Considering these deficits, especially operational deficits, to me on the outside it doesn't seem like a good question to ask just because Ann Arbor is operating in that deficit. To me, why would you even ask that question? It seems really weird. If you have a deficit that the other campus is constantly having to dig you out of, why would you ask to go solo, so to speak? Anyway, I continue reading. Next section. Establishment of this task force. In response to the CFO colleague report, the Board of Regents on February 29, 2024, adopted a resolution for, quote, a special subcommittee to explore the possibility of the Ann Arbor campus applying for self-governance within the Concordia University system, end quote. This report is the result of the mandated special committee's findings. Next up, we have task force composition and process, here on page 7. First section is membership. President Ankerberg and CUWAA Board of Regents Chair Reverend John Berg recruited and organized a task force composed of university regents, senior university administrative staff, and select outside members who brought particular expertise in higher education to the group. Subcommittees were organized with this membership. Below that are 4 boxes. I'm going to address the boxes from top to bottom and then left to right. So starting with the top left box that says accreditation. Here we have the names Reverend Dr. Jameson Hardy, Chair, Dr. Chris Cody, Dr. Elizabeth Polson, Nathan Wingfield. Side note, In the other 3 boxes I'm about to read, I don't see any other women names here, so I highly doubt that any of the women faculty, because I'm sure Ann Arbor has women faculty, because I know Concordia University, Wisconsin has women faculty. I don't see any of them listed here or that any of their feedback was mentioned in this report. So as far as I'm concerned, there's only one woman on this task force. Next up, we have the top right box that's labeled financial. Dr. David Anderson, Chair. John Bruce, Dan Kelly, Mark Stern, Reverend Dr. Harold Tomish. Bottom left box, we have legal. Dave Lambert, Chair. Reverend Jonah Burakowski. Dr. Steve Taylor. Reverend Dr. John Woolrabi. Side note, why do you have 2 reverends on this legal team? Last I checked, their degrees were in divinity and in defending LCMS doctrine and theology, not in legal practice. But I digress. Moving on to the bottom right box and last box, Lutheran identity and mission outcomes. On screen, I have it labeled as Lutheran Identity and Mission Outcome Standards, which is the acronym LIMOS, which is denoted further on page 12. Here we have Friar Mark Braden, Chair. Reverend David Davis. Reverend David Fleming. Reverend Dr. Aaron Moldenhauer. Reverend Dr. Ryan Peterson. Reverend Dr. Richard Stuckwish. Side note, poor guy to be Stuckwish that name. Also, I didn't realize that the LCMS had friars. I thought that was a uniquely Catholic thing. If you would be happy to tell me more or direct me for more information in the comments, I'd be more than happy to do some reading on this. Maybe after I rinse out my brain after having to read this report like 5 times before I recorded this. And okay, I didn't really have to read it. I wanted to read it, and then I reread it, and then I reread it, and reread it some more. I really do like torturing myself. Okay, I continue reading. In addition to these subcommittees, the undersigned acted as chair of the committee as a whole, and President Ankerberg and Reverend Berg were ex officio members. The words ex officio are in italics. Next section, the subcommittee process. The subcommittees worked within their assigned areas with the ability to request any information deemed relevant to aid their deliberations. Subcommittee chairs met with the task force chair and ex officio members to assess progress and facilitate the flow of information. Side note, the words ex officio are again italicized. I continue reading. In addition, the task force held plenary meetings of all members to prevent siloing of ideas or questions, and to ensure the fullest possible review of all issues. Finally, each member of the task force has had the opportunity to review and comment on all parts of this report. It should be noted that this report reflects the judgment of the majority of the members of the task force. Individual members may differ with some or all of its conclusions. Next section. Questions and answers relating to the task force and its process. Some may question the necessity of acting so quickly to address the financial challenges that CUWAA is facing. Theoretically, the university could, for a short time, continue to operate with structural deficits. That practice assumes that 1. The university will still benefit from significant market returns on its endowment. 2. The university advancement team will continue to experience record success with donors. 3. The university will be able to generate the same or more net revenue. At the same time, this assumption does not allow the university to address its capital needs and leaves the university vulnerable to unexpected expenses or contractions in enrollment. The university also needs to act quickly because the analysis of the past few months demonstrates that the university cannot, and with current facilities will not, generate enough auxiliary revenue, parentheses, i.e. revenue from sources other than tuition, end parentheses, to sustain the Ann Arbor campus's operations. Because the university's leadership has this knowledge, the university should steward its resources wisely and pursue plans that allow that campus to operate within the limits of its resources. Continuing to lose millions of dollars in operations puts both campuses at significant risk. The university also should act quickly because the decision to act ethically and announce the financial challenges it is facing has also negatively affected enrollment at the Ann Arbor campus. This reality intensifies the need for the university to reconstruct the financial model for the Ann Arbor campus. Others have asked if other LCMS entities, including a member of the Concordia University System, parentheses CUS, end parentheses, would consider partnering with CUWAA. Currently, no entities have offered resources that would allow us to meet the significant capital needs at the Ann Arbor campus or to subsidize cash flow shortfalls from operations on an ongoing basis. The university has not received any formal offers of resources from other universities within the Concordia University System, and CUWAA can replicate any services that other universities might provide. Next up, here on page 8, Task Force Conclusions. Each subcommittee prepared a separate report. Their reports follow this section. Some subcommittee reports contain appendices, which are included in the copy of this report given to the regents, but are redacted from the public version of this report because they contain sensitive and confidential information. Side note, I highlighted that here on screen. I continue reading. A summary of each subcommittee's conclusions appears below. The reader is referred to the actual subcommittee reports for details. Side note, I underlined that and starred that here in red. First off, I want that full report. I really do. Aside from torturing myself further, I want to know how they plan on paying and creating a broader theological faculty that they want, that they'll later discuss here in the report. I want to know more about LIMOS ideas of what should be done to Lutheranize the campus. And as for the reader being referred to the subcommittee reports for details, are you talking about the public version, or are you talking about the private version, the one that isn't redacted and the one that the regents do have, and the one that would have a wider scope? Is that something that the reader can request? Because I think a reader would definitely be interested in having the full unredacted version. Also, I'm really curious, going back to the previous subsection, where it's like talking about the university needs to act quickly. Why? Are you going to close Ann Arbor? Are you threatening to close Ann Arbor? What exactly is going to be the result if they decide to not have Ann Arbor be its own campus? Because the points are valid about operating in the deficit for as long as they have. So, is there a potential of the campus being shut down or revamped? I wonder. Just a lot of fluff. A lot of fluff here. I continue reading. Next section is accreditation. We all love accreditation. Yes, we do. Here on page 9. Section Conclusions. Point 1. To become separately accredited, CUAA must first establish its own governing board and policies and demonstrate 2 years of financial stability, and thereafter would need to remain connected to CUW during the 3 to 5 year process of accreditation. The HLC accelerated process for initial accreditation would not be an available path to accreditation. Point 2. CUAA would also need separate audited financial statements, which document 2 years of financial stability. Point 3. In addition, there is a, quote, change of control, end quote, process that would have to be followed and satisfied. Point 4. In addition to HLC approval from the Synod's Commission on Constitutional Matters, the CUS Board of Directors, and the Synod's Board of Directors would be required. Side note, that's a lot of approvals that you're going to need. This separation must deem to be worth it if they have to go through all those different board approvals. I'm just imagining all of the nonsense that'll take. Going up to each board and being like, hello, I want to separate. Please sign off on this. And each of the boards are like, well, we don't think you should. And then you have to make your case, and then you are left up to what they decide. So what do you do if one says no? Do you continue on to the next one? Is that hierarchical, or are you making your case to all the boards like around the same time? And then it just seems so administration heavy to me. I continue reading. Point 5. CUAA would need an administrative structure of its own, including a separate board of regents, president, administrators, CFO, CIO, and provost, parentheses, VP of academics, end parentheses, prior to being accredited. Point 6. CUAA would need to have independent operations for software of various sorts, the cost of which is estimated to be in the millions of dollars per year. Next section, major challenges. Point 1, establishing separate governance and policies. Point 2, satisfying HLC of financial stability, particularly the requirement to demonstrate 2 years of stability of operations. Point 3, navigating Synod bylaws and approvals. Point 4, developing independent software and student services systems. Point 5, developing administrative structure. Next section, risks/unknowns. Point 1, whether the HLC would be satisfied with and approve of separate accreditation. Point 2, whether the separation process can fit within Synod's existing bylaws. Side note, up here in the upper right corner of the screen, I have the acronym for the Higher Learning Commission, which is HLC, which is originally noted as the acronym that it is on page 12. Also, what is this change of control process? What are the Synod bylaws and approvals? How much administration does Ann Arbor have to wade through just to get separate from Concordia University, Wisconsin? To me, you'd think that with it being a college that's being run by a denomination, the denomination, yes, they would want to have it carry the hallmarks of that denomination, but you'd think the denomination would be a little bit more accepting / loose / put in term here for not behaving as strictly as they would, say, expect a church to act. You'd think there'd be a separate administrative process for that. And then whoever the Synod president is has to be at the top of that food chain, but then you'd think that that would be a separate, apart from the churches of the Synod. You'd think that'd be separate from that whole process. And maybe it is, and maybe it's because of everything that they reference here. To me, it sounds like everything is just under one huge overall umbrella. If you watch Shiny Happy People, think of that huge Gothard umbrella, that really creepy ass umbrella. Except instead of God, it's the LCMS president, which I believe is currently Harrison, President Harrison. At the top of that umbrella, he's the head umbrella. And then it's God, and then it's the LCMS, and then it's all the churches and the university, but they're all lumped together under a smaller umbrella. Anyway, going back to what I just read, there's a lot of things that Ann Arbor would need to do. Financial stability being crucial to me, but being able to have essentially their own operating system. And the millions of dollars in licensing fees for software is no joke, especially when you consider all of the systems a school needs to be able to have to function for all the different lessons. Software is extremely overpriced. Next up, financial, also on page 9. Section Conclusions. Point 1. For the past 10 years, CUAA has operated at a deficit of $4.8 million per year, being a $3.5 million operating loss plus $1.3 million in depreciation, even after receiving $4.6 million for a one-time sale of property. Point 2. CUW has funded $35.7 million in the past 10 years for deficits incurred at CUAA. Point 3. Increased enrollment at CUAA has not reduced the deficits. Point 4. For CUAA to replace the administrative support currently provided by CUW would increase its cost by $5.4 million per year. Point 5. CUAA requires $700,000 per year for 3 years for physical plant renewal. Point 6. Eliminating the $3.5 million cash deficit, paying the increased cost to be independent, and funding the cost for physical plant renewal adds up to an additional $9.6 million per year cost to operate CUAA independently. Parentheses. Note that this does not include debt service for the land contract recommended by the legal subcommittee. Infra. End parentheses. Point 7. Including inflation for fiscal year 25 to fiscal year 27, CUAA would need to increase revenue by $31.8 million to balance its budget. Point 8. Unrestricted gifts to CUAA have averaged $375,000 per year for the last 5 years. Point 9. Most endowment funds for CUAA are restricted to be used for scholarships, which paid CUAA $643,000 in fiscal year 2023. Point 10. For fiscal year 2023, CUAA's total revenues were $22.5 million. Total expenses were $27.8 million, including $1.8 million in depreciation. Point 11. Financial support from the Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and English districts, the LCMS Board of Directors, and the CUS Board of Directors were contacted to assess interest and ability to provide financial support. Only the Michigan district responded affirmatively. Point 12. The $10 million escrow toward the future operation of CUAA referred to in the resolution adopted on February 29, 2024, is unlikely to be created. Point 13. Regardless of other means to increase revenue, to make CUAA operate independently would require a significant increase in gifts to fund operations. Next section, major challenges. Point 1. Addressing physical plant needs for the campus. Point 2. Cost of athletic programs. Point 3. identifying sources of revenue increase and cost reduction. Next section, risks/unknowns. Point 1, impact of tuition increases on enrollment. Point 2, ability to increase gifts through development, parentheses, needed even if all other means of increasing revenue discussed in the report are successfully implemented, end parentheses. Side note, that's a lot of the use of the word million. Like, I don't get paid in the six figures. I can barely imagine what a million would be like, and it's just being tossed around here like it means absolutely nothing to the Concordia system, to LCMS. Just, how can you lose that much money? I just don't understand. Next up, legal on page 10. Section, conclusions. Point 1, 2 years should be allowed to secure approval from the LCMS's Board of Directors. Point 2, a land contract sale from Concordia University Incorporated to the independent CUAA is recommended at a cost of $1.6 million per year for the entire campus, or $1.16 million per year for the main campus. Next section, major challenges. Point 1, reversionary agreement in title for main campus. Point 2, Synod Board of Directors approval of property changes. Point 3, lease of Michigan District Office. Next section, risks/unknowns. Point 1, renegotiating and modifying reversionary agreement to fit new institutional structure. Point 2, ability of independent CUAA to service land contract debt. Next up, we have my favorite part. Here on page 11 is Lutheran identity and mission outcome standards. This is what I originally wanted to read in the report. Section, conclusions. First point, there are many positive indications of Lutheran mission and identity on the Ann Arbor campus. Side note, I have the word where with a question mark after it listed on the screen here. This is partly why I want the unredacted report. I really want to know why they think there are many positive indications and where they are, because we go to point 2. Time and resources are needed to focus the Christian identity of the campus to a distinctly Lutheran identity. Well, wait a minute. Side note here. You said in point 1 there's many positive indications of Lutheran mission and identity. And then you go to point 2 to say time and resources are needed to focus it to become more distinctly Lutheran. Why? What is the reasoning? Moving on to point 3, the campus should add a chief mission officer and another campus pastor. Side note, that's going to increase your deficit. And why? Why do they need to add a chief mission officer? Don't you think that's the job of the campus pastor? And please note, I am not blaming the campus pastor for anything of this. I think the campus pastor, like pretty much any pastor role on any campus anywhere or religious authority figure, they tend to get underpaid and they tend to be asked to work ridiculous hours. I have mad respect for any person who works those positions because they usually believe it really, really strongly. My big objection here is, why does the committee recommend that a chief mission officer have to be added as well as another pastor? Is it because the current campus pastor is being overloaded and overburdened? Or is it because they agree with this time and resources are needed to focus the Christian identity to a distinctly Lutheran identity? A majority of your students aren't even Lutheran. And I know I said it before. We'll get to that later. Point 4, the theology faculty should also be increased. Side note, where is the budget for that? Does that ever get discussed? Spoiler alert, it does not. At least not in this public report, which makes me question why. And what is in the unredacted version? Point, and I can't say this without laughing, point 5, there is a paucity of Lutheran symbols, ... on campus. You just got done in point 1 saying there are many positive indications of Lutheran mission and identity. Why are you so caught up? Why are your panties in a twist about there being a paucity or scarcity of Lutheran symbols on campus? It's not a church. It is a college. You could make the argument that for a seminary college, they should have more religious symbolisms, especially for when you get into the different denominations and what denomination holds what symbolisms dear. I agree with that, but Ann Arbor is not a seminary. Point 6, chapel services should be focused to project a distinctly Lutheran identity. Okay, side note here. It's like they took point 1 and they just completely undermined it with points 2 through 6. It's like point 1 doesn't even matter as a point in of itself. It's just there to soften the blow of points 2 through 6. This is very much a denominational way of saying, well, we don't want this to be completely negative, but when we talk about our Lutheran identity, we really need to focus on these things. And so we should lead off with something positive with that and then completely undermine it without realizing we're undermining the first point. Bite the bullet, make it completely depressing. That is what your job is. The financials are already depressing. Your LIMOS standards are just going to be a cherry on the depressing cake. Next section, major challenges. Point 1, understanding of Lutheran mission and identity needs to be enhanced significantly. Never mind, apparently they also wanted to continue this undermining in the next section, I guess. Point 2, a high percentage of students who are not members of LCMS congregations. Side note, I have written here on screen a red arrow leading from point 2 to the word risky with an exclamation mark after it, and I also have written on the other side, shut off enrollment ? And also that it is negatively worded. I don't think they thought this through when they were writing it, but you do not identify the people who are funding your campus as challenges, especially when the majority of them don't come from LCMS congregations. First off, I'd like to point out something. When you have a high percentage of people who attend who are not from your congregation, that's probably because either A, you have really good programs, B, you have somewhat good programs, somewhat average programs, but the students couldn't get accepted at other schools, and because of the amount of jobs out there that require bachelor degrees or higher, your campus was seen as the best fit for them, especially for fields like nursing. At that point, you really just have to financially bite the bullet and say, well, Are we going to just cater to the distinctly LCMS students? Or do we want to continue running as a university and allow other people from other denominations attend just so that they can, we can get paid, and I guess, them walking out the door with a degree is also kind of important. You never, ever label them as a major challenge, because what are you going to do? Force them to be LCMS? Have them, before they graduate, be required to sign a document saying, I am going to be an LCMS member for at least the next 99 years? Or something equally ridiculous? Did you even think about the reception could be to that point? I don't think you did. I continue reading. Point 3, keeping Lutheran identity and mission at the forefront while creating a new Board of Regents and campus administration. Boy. Side note, I have written here in red, affect CUW2 ? As much as this report talks about Ann Arbor, I am struggling to figure out if this is also supposed to be a dig at Concordia, University of Wisconsin as well. Especially since LIMOS seems to be a relatively new LCMS task force. I don't want to call them a committee because they don't really sound like a committee, and there's more elaboration on what LIMOS does later in this transcription, but essentially they're a task force, and it sounds like they were created relatively recently because some people think that LCMS needs to be more religiously LCMS, and not just how they observe it, but also publicly. Just this whole section just reads and comes off with this arrogant LCMS mindset. And this is, to me personally, it just seems like it comes off with this arrogant LCMS mindset of, we know best, there's not enough people who needs to be LCMS, Concordia needs to be about converting these people to LCMS, and they haven't been following the rules, and therefore they deserve all the slaps on the wrist that we can give them because they haven't been doing this. Yeah, we know the financials are a mess, but this is where we're truly upset. I didn't understand that mindset when I was in the wells, and I don't understand it now. Moving on to the next section, risks/unknowns. The one and only point states none specifically identified. Side note, none specifically identified? Seriously, how about the fact that you listed a high percentage of students who are not members of LCMS congregations as a major challenge? How about potentially losing at least half of your enrollment because of your poor choice of words? Also, I want to thank my partner for this part. At the very least, they should have taken a lesson from Paul and listed God. Because similar to what my note reads on screen, which I'm just going to condense for you here, just list God for your unknowns or risks. Like, just say that, yes, God, like we trust God to handle the risks. Like they can't even do that for this report. They can't even go that religious leap of what we know there's going to be risks, but God's got us. God's watching out for us. They just no. They couldn't even go that far. On second thought, I don't think LIMOS is doing as good a job as LCMS wants them to do, because if they're not smart enough to even possibly identify some risks/unknowns that I identified upon reading this, and I'm not part of the LCMS, I don't think they're really going to be as effective as the LCMS thinks that they're going to be. That, or they have an idea of what the risks or unknowns are going to be, and they don't want to list them out because they don't want to seem more negative. Well, they should have thought about that when they started complaining about the student body not being predominantly LCMS. Moving on to conclusion. The Board of Regents must assess the information presented to decide whether separating CUAA to operate as an independent entity is feasible. As identified by CFO colleague, the principal challenge for CUAA is funding. To begin the process to be accredited separately, CUAA would need to set up its own governing board, adopt basic institutional policies, and demonstrate at least 2 years of stable operations. Thereafter, the actual process of accreditation would take another 3 to 5 years. Separate status would increase operational costs by $6.1 million per year. Adding the historical $3.5 million structural cash flow deficit, parentheses, and ignoring the $1.3 million in annual depreciation, end parentheses, results in a need for $9.6 million per year in added revenue before the land contract recommended by the legal subcommittee is considered. That land contract would add an additional $1.6 million in cost, bringing the total shortfall to be covered to $11.2 million per year. The 2023 revenue for CUAA was $22.5 million, so the increased need amounts to approximately 50% of the present budget. The financial subcommittee pulled various possible sources of support, and only the Michigan district has indicated a willingness to provide such, though in a sum far less than the need. Furthermore, no interest has been shown by any stakeholder in providing the $10 million escrow suggested in the resolution of February 29, 2024. Finally, none of the financial analysis in this report considers the functional obsolescence of many of the main campus buildings at CUAA. The Regents will recall that when they toured the campus in November 2024, it was obvious that present dormitories, one major classroom building, the chapel, and the field house were all falling short of properly serving the needs of the university in various ways, and would require either replacement or major upgrades. Those costs are in addition to the analysis provided in this report. Financial and accreditation concerns aside, tasks identified by the legal and Lutheran identity and mission outcome standards, parentheses, LIMOS, end parentheses, subcommittees seem generally manageable, with some minor legal uncertainty. Side note, that entire sentence that I just read, I have marked here on screen. To me, it just seems so weird. Like you're going to have it just feels icky to me. And I think if you don't already have that feeling, I think further on in the report, in this public redacted version, I think you'll understand why. To me, it seems like it's just starting a LCMS version of a potential witch hunt. But that's just my paranoia, probably. I continue reading. Separate accreditation is, however, not a guaranteed outcome of the accreditation process, given uncertainties as to the judgment of the accrediting body and the vicissitudes of Synod bylaws. David A. Peeler, Regent and Task Force Chair. Next up, we have the Accreditation Subcommittee report, here on page 12. The Accreditation Subcommittee is charged with understanding and conveying the accreditation options to aid the board in determining the viability of an autonomous CUAA. Specifically, the subcommittee reviewed accreditation requirements of the Higher Learning Commission and those of accreditors of specific programs at CUAA. Side note, I highlighted or underlined the Higher Learning Commission in red because they don't have the parentheses HLC after it. I continue reading. The Higher Learning Commission, the accreditor for the institution, requires institutions to demonstrate how they meet the criteria for accreditation. HLC outlines requirements to pursue candidacy for accreditation, assumed practices, and federal regulations. HLC does not include program-specific accreditor requirements, state licensure requirements, nor Department of Education (DOE) regulations for institutional accreditation. Though some HLC accreditation requirements enforce DOE regulations. Section: Avenues to accreditation. There are 2 avenues for institutions to seek accreditation. Point 1. Accelerated process for initial accreditation. The accelerated process for initial accreditation features a reduced timeline to achieving accreditation while still assuring rigor and protection for student success. This process is only available to institutions that meet certain qualifications prior to and throughout the process. This includes being currently accredited by a historically regional accreditor or a state entity recognized by the DOE as an institutional accreditor, and being in good standing with that accreditor. Institutions that meet the qualifications for the accelerated process for initial accreditation may pursue accreditation through this process. Subpoint: per the HLC liaison (staff position at HLC that is assigned to work directly with CUWAA), quote, a branch campus of an HLC institution, whether separately incorporated and/or separately accredited, would not meet the requirements for the accelerated process for initial accreditation. End quote. Point 2. Eligibility process and candidacy. Most new member institutions achieve accreditation through the eligibility process and candidacy. In this process, the institution must show it meets the eligibility criteria and complies with the HLC's eligibility requirements. During candidacy, the institution works to demonstrate compliance with HLC's criteria for accreditation and other HLC requirements. The candidacy period is typically 4 years. HLC cites that the total process, including eligibility process, can range from 3 to 5 years. End parentheses. Subpoint 1. In this process, for CUAA to maintain institutional accreditation while undergoing the eligibility process and candidacy, CUAA would have to remain under CUW's accreditation for the entire length of the eligibility process and candidacy period. Separating from CUW prior to receiving accreditation through the HLC would leave CUAA without institutional accreditation. Without institutional accreditation, CUAA could offer degrees but could not be considered an accredited institution, which hinders transfer to other institutions, degree validity, and students' eligibility to receive federal student aid. Subpoint 2. Given that CUAA is considered a branch campus of CUW, the timeline to begin the eligibility process and candidacy is likely longer than the cited 3 to 5 year process. This is because CUAA will need time to establish independence in meeting the HLC requirements and criteria for accreditation. Side note, I don't have anything to snark on here. This all just sounds like a lengthy, hard process. And to me, I don't know why Ann Arbor would dream of opening themselves up to this. I continue reading. These are the only 2 avenues for accreditation through HLC. HLC policy indicates that a component of an accredited institution can seek separate accreditation. A component of an institution, quote, ... shall include all branch campuses, additional locations, other instructional sites, and any divisions offering distance education or correspondence education, regardless of where operating, end quote. An accredited institution could include a separately incorporated branch campus as one of its components. Specifically, correspondence from CUWAA's HLC liaison states the following. This next section is in italics. Assuming the institution intends for the separately incorporated branch campus to remain within the institution's accreditation, it would need to meet the, quote, characteristics of a component that may be included in the institution's accredited or candidate status, unquote, as detailed in HLC policy. There are a variety of ways that a separately incorporated component of an institution could meet these requirements. It would be up to the entities to define and establish these arrangements. This could include, for example, through corporate structures such as subsidiaries and/or superordinate entities, or through documented legal arrangements such as a management agreement. If an institutional component, parentheses, such as a branch campus, end parentheses, that is not currently separately incorporated were to become separately incorporated, that would involve a change of control, structure, or ownership under HLC 2 policies for the institution. This next section is bolded. Note that a separately incorporated component of an institution would still need to go through HLC's eligibility process, parentheses, and candidacy, end parentheses, in order to become separately accredited, end bold. Moreover, a separately accredited component such as a branch campus, parentheses, whether or not it is separately incorporated, end parentheses, would almost certainly need to go through a change of control process at the time it wished to no longer be a branch campus of another institution. This is because the governance structures in place for the branch campus to have been an accreditable component of the institution in the first place would then necessarily need to be altered in order for the branch campus to become fully independent. This change in governance structure would implicate HLC's change of control policies. Given that a component of an accredited institution can seek accreditation, the subcommittee reviewed what is required for the component to seek accreditation. HLC outlines characteristics of a separately accreditable component in its policies. The policy states that, quote, an existing component of an accredited institution may seek separate accreditation as an independent institution if it has the following characteristics. Point 1. It has been authorized, under board policy, to have substantial financial and administrative independence from the accredited institution, including in matters related to its personnel. Side note, the italics ended when I read the sentence, this change in governance structure would implicate HLC's change of control policies. I got so caught up in reading, I completely forgot to say that. Moving on to point 2. It has a full-time chief administrative officer. Point 3. It is empowered under board policy to initiate and sustain its own academic programs. Point 4. It has independent degree granting authority in the state or jurisdiction in which it is located. And point 5. Public information about the institution, the component, and any corporate parent or structure is consistent with the characterization of the entity as a separately accreditable entity. End quote. Side note, I'm not sure why they put... Oh, never mind. I found it. So these are all points of this policy under HLC. Again, to me, this is just a lot of work that Ann Arbor would have to go through for a lot of expense, for a lot of money that it doesn't have. Anyway, I continue reading. Next section. Significant items to address to pursue eligibility process and candidacy. There are several steps that an institution must take throughout the eligibility process and candidacy to establish accreditation that must initially be documented in the forms below, including point 1, application for HLC membership, point 2, substantial presence form, point 3, institutional date form, point 4, compliance with eligibility requirements form, point 5, compliance with assumed practices form, point 6, federal compliance overview and filing form. Highlighted below are significant items that must be addressed in order for CUAA to move forward with the eligibility process and candidacy. As with any institution under review, there is no guarantee that all items could be addressed to the satisfaction of HLC reviewers. Section 1. LCMS Bylaws. Point 1. Synod bylaws do not explicitly provide for a process of separating CUWAA into two institutions, both of which would operate under the CUS. The term, quote, separate, end quote, in bylaw 3.6.6.1, parentheses P, end parentheses, refers to separation from CUS and Synod, not division of an institution. Point 2. Per the Secretary of Synod, division of the institution would likely require approval by the Commission on Constitutional Matters, parentheses CCM, end parentheses, the CUS Board of Directors, and the Synod Board of Directors on a number of matters related to bylaw sections 3.6 and 3.10 to ensure conformity with Synod bylaws. Point 3. Per the eligibility requirements with the HLC, an institution applying for accreditation must have, quote, ... a governing board that possesses and exercises the necessary legal power to establish and review the basic policies that govern the institution, end quote. Subpoint 1. CUAA must have its own Board of Regents in place to pursue individual accreditation. Subpoint 2. The rules of HLC accreditation may allow two separate boards to operate in this manner, based on the characteristics of a separately accreditable component. However, Synod bylaws do not currently address this issue. It appears a CCM ruling may be required to determine if bylaw 3.10.6.3 would be violated by the establishment of a separate, independent Board of Regents for CUAA before the institution was independently accredited and separated from CUW. Section 2. Necessary personnel. Point 1. For CUAA to become autonomous, additional personnel need to be added. HLC requires evidence of substantial presence in the application process toward candidacy, yet does not provide an exhaustive list of required institutional positions. It can be determined from the questions listed on the substantial presence form that the following positions are required for an institution to pursue accreditation. Subpoint 1, President. Subpoint 2, Senior Administrator/Cabinet, parentheses, no specific positions appear to be required. However, an institution must prove it has the positions needed to fulfill its mission, end parentheses. Subpoint 3, Chief Financial Officer. Subpoint 4, Chief Information Officer. Subpoint 5, VP, side note, Vice President, of Academics/Provost. Section 3, Evaluation of processes with institutional operational needs for accreditation. Point 1. An autonomous CUAA must demonstrate the ability to serve students effectively as an institution of higher education. An autonomous CUAA must also ensure compliance with the criteria for accreditation. To that end, CUAA would be required to obtain and finance its own systems that CUWAA currently has in place to operate the university and serve students, parentheses, e.g. a student information system, such as Banner, and a learning management system, such as Blackboard or Canvas, end parentheses. Point 2. Other systems currently offered through CUW that may be desirable for operations and student service needs, including accessibility services software, parentheses, AIM, or AIM, end parentheses, student success/advising software, parentheses, EAB Navigate, end parentheses, portal software, parentheses, Pathify, end parentheses, student conduct management software, parentheses, Maxient, end parentheses, residential housing management software, parentheses, StarRes, end parentheses, human resources management software, parentheses, Applicant Pro, end parentheses, registrar office/student records management software, parentheses, DegreeWorks, CourseLeaf, Course Eval, end parentheses, room scheduling software, parentheses, EMS, end parentheses. Side note, it is hilarious to me that there's a room scheduling software that's EMS. That if you're not careful, you can get a little mixed up, and I hope it's not life-threatening. I continue on. Point 3. While finances are not the focus of this subcommittee, HLC requires an amount of infrastructure to be in place while seeking accreditation during the eligibility process and candidacy. The cost of this type of infrastructure building is excessive, depending on institutional needs and student enrollment. Licenses on software cannot be shared through separate institutions, though many consortiums offer discounts. For example, the initial startup cost for Canvas at another Wisconsin Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, parentheses, WICU, end parentheses, institution with an undergraduate enrollment of 900 was $4 million. Side note, I think you need to talk to finances. That is huge chunk of change to be spending on licenses. Section 4, Financial Data. Point 1. The HLC eligibility requirements include several pieces of evidence. CUAA would need to provide the following, in addition to other materials, to begin the accreditation seeking process. Documentation provided would also need to meet the thresholds set by HLC. Subpoint 1. 3 years of comparative budgets. Notes are to include the basic assumptions underlying the budgets. Subpoint 2. Cash flow analyses for the past 2 years. Subpoint 3. The institution's primary reserve ratio calculated as, parentheses, expendable net assets / total expenses, end parentheses. Subpoint 4. 2 most recent financial audits for the institution. CUAA would need to provide financial audits reflective of the CUAA campus only. If the past 2 institutional audits are used, parentheses, which include CUW and CUAA information, end parentheses, significant work would need to take place to separate CUAA-specific finances. There are a number of other HLC requirements during the eligibility process and candidacy that CUAA will have to meet in order to become autonomous. These are the major areas this subcommittee was able to identify during this review. Other areas may also be of concern to other reviewers, including HLC accreditation assessors. Other areas may be very simple for CUAA to accomplish toward this end. Next section. Programs at CUAA that would be impacted by accreditation changes. CUAA has a number of programs that are individually accredited by entities other than HLC. Some are also approved by the state of Michigan on the program level, and/or graduates would be certified or licensed if they work in Michigan. These include all the education majors and healthcare programs such as nursing, physical therapy, occupational therapy, physician assistant, athletic training, social work, radiologic technology, radiology technicians, basically. I continue reading. And diagnostic medical sonography. Program reduction or autonomy for CUAA would have implications for these accreditors. Next up, we have the Finance Subcommittee Report. Section: General Direction and Included Scope. The Finance Subcommittee of the CUAA Task Force was directed to assess the ability of CUAA as a standalone university to attain financial sustainability. Next section: Excluded Scope. The subcommittee's work presupposes that an independent CUAA would continue to operate a residential undergraduate program primarily on the current campus. Thus, although recognizing the significant costs associated with maintaining the current campus, the subcommittee did not consider models that would involve transitioning CUAA to a primarily online or virtual university, nor selling the main campus property and consolidating operations on the current North Campus. As stipulated in the February 29th Board of Regents resolution appointing the task force, other CUS schools were not approached to serve as financial partners for the Ann Arbor campus. Next section, summary. We confirmed that over the last decade, CUAA lost approximately $4.8 million every year on average. Of this amount, $3.5 million per year was a cash operating loss. The remainder was depreciation expense, parentheses, deferred maintenance, end parentheses. Even though unfunded depreciation does not directly reduce operating cash, it has resulted in a backlog of physical plant renewal needs on the CUAA campus. These losses occurred consistently, despite undergraduate enrollment growth of 36% during the same time period. Much of CUAA's growth was driven by a large increase in the number of student athletes. In fiscal year 2023, CUAA spent, on average, $8,060 per student athlete to operate intercollegiate athletic programs. For the reasons set forth in the CFO colleague report, the high cost of operating athletic programs, equal to 31% of total net tuition revenue in fiscal year 23, meant that higher enrollment did not reduce the operating deficit. CUAA incurred significant losses during the last several years that it operated as an independent institution. In the decades since the merger, CUW reduced CUAA's operating costs by assuming into the Wisconsin campus budget, parentheses, effectively an operating subsidy to CUAA, end parentheses, most of the cost for many CUAA overhead expenses. The items currently managed by CUW, parentheses, listed on page 19, end parentheses, include senior staff administration development, recruitment and marketing, professional services, software and accreditation, and would, parentheses, based on fiscal year 23 figures, end parentheses, add approximately $5.4 million to CUAA's annual operating costs if performed by CUAA independently. There are also urgent physical plant renewal needs averaging about $700,000 annually over the next 3 years. Thus, in addition to covering the existing cash deficit of $3.5 million per year, an independent CUAA would need to fund additional annual operating costs of $5.4 million and additional annual physical plant expenses of $700,000. Parentheses, all based on fiscal year 23 figures, end parentheses. This would require additional annual revenue of $9.6 million to, quote, break even, end quote, based on fiscal year 23 figures. If revenues and expenses each escalated 5% per year for inflation, and assuming no major changes in enrollment or operations, then in nominal dollars, a total of at least $31.8 million in new revenue would be needed to break even over a 3-year period, parentheses, fiscal year 25 through fiscal year 27. Next up, current operational reality. Section, structural deficit, significant annual losses for a decade. Over the last 10 completed fiscal years, and after including $4.6 million in gain from a one-time property sale, the CUAA campus has lost $35.7 million from operations on a, quote, cash, end quote, basis, without including depreciation expense. This loss was funded by CUW from its resources. These ongoing and consistent losses occurred despite the fact that enrollment has grown continuously, both undergraduate, parentheses, 653 to 889 students, end parentheses, and overall, parentheses, 999 to 1,256 students, end parentheses. The CFO colleague report explains the reason for this. Essentially, all of the revenue received from additional enrollment was spent on additional expenses, so there was no net gain. This average loss of approximately $3.5 million per year would increase to $4.8 million per year if depreciation were included. This amount represents the approximate $5 million per year structural deficit referenced by President Ankerberg during community discussions. Depreciation expense needs to be considered as a regular part of operations versus engaging in, quote, deferred maintenance, end quote. Not funding regular upkeep and renewal of the physical plant results in higher costs later as items break down and need immediate replacement. Finance staff have advised that the current backlog of capital repair and replacement projects anticipated within the next 3 years is approximately $2.1 million, based on current year costs, in addition to scheduled annual maintenance and repair spending. The following discussion, with all numbers rounded to the nearest 0.1 million, reviews the operating costs for fiscal year 2023, which is the most recently completed fiscal year, parentheses, from July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023, end parentheses. However, the same general trend has held for the last decade, with one significant exception. During fiscal year 2022, CUAA sold a major capital asset, part of the campus real estate, for $4.6 million, the proceeds of which were used to reduce the annual operating deficit for that year only. Section: Sources of Revenue. The two main sources of revenue for CUAA are tuition and revenue from auxiliary enterprises, parentheses, mainly student housing and food service, end parentheses. These account for over 95% of annual revenues. Unrestricted gift revenue for fiscal year 2023 was approximately $350,000 and has averaged approximately $375,000 per year over the last 5 years. For fiscal year 2023, CUAA recorded gross tuition revenue of $31.2 million, but after allowing for $14.4 million in scholarships, parentheses equals tuition discounts, end parentheses, net tuition revenue actually received was $16.8 million. The net tuition received is included in total revenues. Most CUAA endowment funds are restricted so that the annual endowment income must be applied for scholarship use. CUAA's accounting practice is to record these endowment distributions as an offset to scholarship expenses. In fiscal year 2023, gross scholarship expenses were about $15 million. This was reduced by endowment distributions for scholarships in the amount of approximately $643,000. So the net reported scholarship expense was approximately $14.4 million, parentheses, equals $15 million less the $643,000 endowment payout, end parentheses. Gross revenue from auxiliary enterprises was $4.7 million. This next sentence is entirely in bold. Total revenues were approximately $22.5 million. And bold. Section: Expenses. Major CUAA expense categories, parentheses rounded, and parentheses, included: first, staff salaries and benefits, $8.2 million. Second, faculty salaries and benefits, $7.2 million. Third, general services, parentheses, program, travel, supplies, end parentheses, $2 million. Fourth, depreciation, $1.8 million. 5. Cost of goods sold, parentheses, including food service, end parentheses, $1.5 million. 6. Contracted services, $1.2 million. 7. Student worker and graduate assistants, $1.1 million. 8. Campus capital expenditures, $1.1 million. 9. Utilities, $1 million. 10. 10 would be materials and supplies. That's also $1 million. 11. Insurance, $500,000. 12. Debt service on Michigan Church Extension Fund loan, $270,000. This next sentence is all in bold. Total expenses were approximately $27.8 million. And bold. Including approximately $1.8 million in depreciation, resulting in the $5.3 million deficit for fiscal year 2023. Expenses do not include scholarship expense, which is netted out of the total revenues. Significantly, the above expenses include approximately $5.2 million incurred to operate athletic programs, primarily staff salaries and benefits, and travel costs. The largest programs by spend are listed in the table below, with total annual cost of operation, number of participants, spending per participant, and spending per participant as a percentage of average tuition revenue per student. Below that, we see a grid, charting out at the top, program, number of participants, annual cost in dollar amount, dollars spent per participant, and finally, as percentage of average tuition revenue per student. The column on the left-hand side shows the different sports. At the top reads all sports, underneath is football, underneath that is men's hockey, and underneath that is baseball. For all sports, the number of participants is 645. Annual cost for that program was $5.2 million. Money spent per participant was $8,060. And then the percentage of average tuition revenue for each student in all sports was 68.2%. Football, number of participants in football was 138. Annual cost for football was $800,000. Money spent per participant was $5,797, and the percentage was 49.1%. Men's hockey, 39 participants. Annual cost, $365,000. Number of money spent per participant, $9,359. Percentage was 79.2%. Finally, baseball had 52 participants. $360,000 was spent for the program. Money spent per participant was $6,923, and the percentage of tuition revenue per student was 58.6%. Underneath this chart reads, figures derived from fiscal year 23 CUAA key metrics, finances all funds, fiscal year 14 through fiscal year 23, athletic expenses and athletic counts, CUAA athletic records, average tuition revenue of $11,814 per student from, quote, financial health check, an independent review of the operational costs of CUW and CUAA, end quote, CFO colleague, February 1st, 2024. Next up, continuation plan. As directed, the subcommittee has estimated the financial requirements for CUAA to continue to operate using its current model and campus with no major changes, except that it would have to create and fund the infrastructure to operate as a freestanding institution. Section: Additional infrastructure and support for freestanding institution. The additional material items required to operate a freestanding institution, including the estimated amount, parentheses, if any, and parentheses, currently allocated to CUAA, the estimated cost to provide these items independently, and the net impact on CUAA's annual operating budget include, parentheses, based on fiscal year 23, and parentheses, And it leads into this chart below, where at the top are 3 columns that read item, current budget allocation, and net additional annual cost. The column on the left reads as follows: staff administration positions, development, recruitment and marketing, professional services, information technology infrastructure, accreditation costs, equals annual incremental cost, plus physical plant needs, total additional costs versus fiscal year 23 budget. Side note, I know what you must be thinking. Where is the section that was, where is the section for theological faculty or adding additional faculty? I know that they're talking about just adding infrastructure and support, but considering LIMOS' suggestion that they needed to add more theological faculty in order to be more LCMS traditional, you'd think that that item would have been budgeted for and put here, because you need to know how much adding theological faculty is going to cost. If they're so concerned about not appearing Lutheran enough or not indoctrinating the campus enough to be Lutheran, you would think that they would at least think about the numbers that would be required to pay for adding theological faculty to campus. Maybe they did, and maybe that got cut out of this report. However, the public-facing version shows no consideration for adding theological faculty. Not how much it would cost, not planning how many members they're thinking of adding. So that leads to a lot of questions. Such as, are they serious about following LIMOS' suggestions? How serious are they with this idea of Ann Arbor separating and becoming its own independent campus? Are they looking at these numbers and seriously considering that Ann Arbor should not separate from Concordia University of Wisconsin? And then everything else here is just, well, if we get to it, we get to it. In the hierarchy of what to consider when a campus wants to splinter off and become its own unique institution, I wonder how high on that scale is LIMOS and their suggestions for making the campus more good Lutheran. Anyway, back to this chart here. First item, staff administration positions. The current budget allocation is $210,000. Net additional annual cost would be $1 million. Development. Current allocation is $100,000. Additional annual cost would be $200,000. Excuse me. Recruitment and marketing. Current allocation is $450,000. Additional annual would be $420,000. Professional services currently allocated at $70,000. Net additional annual cost would be $50,000. Information technology infrastructure current allocation is $170,000. Net additional annual cost would be $3.7 million. Accreditation costs. Current allocation is $0. Net additional annual cost would be $50,000. Annual incremental cost only has numbers in the net additional annual cost, and that's $5,420,000. For physical plant needs, current budget allocation is $1,070,000. Net additional annual cost would be $700,000. Total additional costs versus fiscal year 23 budget. That's under the net additional annual cost, which is totaled at $6,120,000. Underneath the table reads sources, CUAA financial reports and administrative staff estimates based on available data. A table listing these items in more detail appears on page 25. The list is not necessarily exhaustive. Before we jump to that table, a side note here, they're going through all of the categories in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to read out the categories and the additional detail they provide, and then we will go to page 25. First up, staff administration positions. Here I have highlighted Higher Learning Commission, parentheses, HLC, end parentheses. That's highlighted because that acronym was hard to find. Anyway, I continue reading. Higher Learning Commission, parentheses, HLC, end parentheses. Accreditation requires institutions to have a minimum of a president, provost, and chief financial officer. However, many other functions currently performed by CUW will need to be added, including a president, CFO, provost, VP for enrollment, director of financial aid, Title IX coordinator / dean of students, accountant, and registrar. Side note, this is already potentially a problem because Title IX coordinator needs to be separate from dean of students. When you have someone whose specific role is to investigate in campus sexual assaults, they should not be combined with the overall dean of students. Dean of students is going to focus on grades and academic achievement and whether or not the student gets along well with the rest of the campus body. Title IX coordinator is essentially a non-commissioned police officer that's doing some investigative work whenever sexual assault or rape allegations are made. Those two should not be combined, otherwise you have a huge area that could be abused. Say someone makes sexual assault allegations against another student, but that student is very popular and well liked on campus. When you are the dean of students, you're going to be tempted and you're also going to have additional pressure put on you because you know how good that student is, and you are going to have a lot of pressure put on you and probably internal pressure as well to not get rid of the student or not to file charges because the student makes your campus look good. Anyway, they apparently believe that Title IX is so unimportant that it can just be combined with Dean of Students, which boggles my mind, especially when you want to be a more conservative campus. You want to be a more conservative Lutheran campus. You think your tradition is the best. Fine. At the very least, don't combine the person whose job it is to be the safe space for your students in with the dean of students. Those two roles are not the same. And I want to slap whoever it is that said, oh, we can just combine these two roles. Moving on. So, going back to this first point where it's talking about staff administration positions, underneath it says current allocation, $210,000, net annual additional cost is $1 million. So this is revisiting the numbers that were in the table on the previous page. Number 2, development. CUAA will require at least 2 additional advancement staff. Current allocation, $100,000. Net annual additional cost, $200,000. Point 3, recruitment and marketing. CUAA will require its own recruitment and marketing offices. Current allocation, $450,000. Net annual additional cost, $420,000. Point 4. Professional services. CUAA will require a separate annual audit to create normalized financial statements, as well as filing of IRS Form 990 and a single audit for federal funds through the Department of Education. CUAA will also require legal services, risk management, other purchase services. Current allocation, $70,000. Net annual additional cost, $50,000. Point 5. Information technology infrastructure. CUAA will require separate licenses for the Banner ERP system, student management software, Blackboard, and other items currently provided through a single license paid by CUW. It is estimated that the annual additional incremental cost will be $1.5 million for software, $800,000 for infrastructure and hardware, $400,000 for external support, $50,000 for IT operating costs, and $950,000 for additional personnel, in order to run a completely freestanding information technology infrastructure on the Ann Arbor campus. These estimates exclude costs of a data transfer from the CUW Banner system and similar one-time costs, which could vary depending on how much data is brought over and in what way. Current allocation, $170,000. Net annual additional cost, $3.7 million. Point 6. Accreditation one-time startup costs. Within 3 years, CUAA must obtain its own accreditation from the HLC. Currently, CUW manages this process. There are significant startup costs involved. Current allocation, $0. Net annual additional cost, $50,000, parentheses, $150,000 total divided by 3 years, end parentheses. Note, they really should have put that as a sidebar in that table on page 20. Because this table here for the continuation plan on page 20, it's pretty important to know, at least in my less than humble opinion, pretty important to know that it's $50,000 for the next 3 years. That's important for planning ahead for future fiscal years. Moving on, point 7. Capital maintenance and improvements. Due to financial constraints, CUAA has largely operated on a, quote, fix when broken, end quote, model. To continue as a viable institution into the future, it will need a proactive capital renewal plan to address the backlog of deferred maintenance items. Current high-priority needs within the next 3 years include, parentheses, in current dollars, end parentheses, $500,000 for a new gym roof, $250,000 for track and grounds work, and $1,350,000 for building improvements, parentheses, fire alarm system and elevators required by state of Michigan, end parentheses. The net annual additional cost below is the sum of these 3 items, parentheses, $2.1 million, end parentheses, divided by 3. Current allocation, $1,070,000. Net annual additional cost, $700,000. Thus, the overall additional annual cost required for the continuation plan would be approximately $6.1 million per year using fiscal year 23 figures. Additionally, the existing annual cash operating deficit of approximately $3.5 million would still have to be covered. The subcommittee determined that the initial launch plan for an independent CUAA should have immediate effect and should cover the next 3 academic years, 2024 to 2025, 2025 to 2026, and 2026 to 2027. Thus, the total shortfall over the implementation period would be approximately $31.8 million, assuming that expenses increase 5% per year versus the prior year, and that the new CUAA would be able to increase revenues at the same rate. Below that is another chart. This chart has, in the banner going across, the different fiscal years ending with a 3-year total. So going from fiscal year 2024 to 2025, which is known as fiscal year 25, fiscal year 2025 to 2026, which is known as fiscal year 26, and then finally fiscal year 2026 to 2027, which will ultimately be known as fiscal year 27, and then 3-year total. Going back to the vertical column, it shows current revenues, then current expenses, then additional expenses, and then finally the shortfall. The revenues projected for fiscal year 25 is $23.6 million. Expenses projected for that same year is $27.3 million. Additional expenses is $6.4 million. Total shortfall expected is $10.1 million. For fiscal year 26, current revenues projected at $24.8 million, expenses projected at $28.6 million, and additional expenses projected $6.7 million. For the shortfall to be $10.5 million. For fiscal year 27, current revenues projected $26 million. Expenses projected $30.1 million. Additional expenses $7.1 million. The shortfall in total being $11.2 million. Over the 3-year total, the revenues would be projected as $74.4 million, expenses projected at $86 million, and additional expenses projected at $20.2 million, with a total shortfall over the 3 years being $31.8 million. The above table was generated by adding 5% to the fiscal year 23 numbers referenced above for each year and increasing assumed revenues, parentheses, tuition and auxiliary, end parentheses, assumed current expenses, and assumed additional expenses by 5% each subsequent year. To avoid double counting physical plant costs, current expenses were calculated based on fiscal year 23, excluding is in all caps, depreciation, and additional expenses were calculated including is in all caps, required additional physical plant spending. These figures also assume that enrollment will be generally constant despite the ongoing decline in available student populations. Because CUAA is operating at a deficit, increasing revenues and expenses by the same rate simply yields a widening deficit. Thus, a combination of increased revenue and decreased expenses would be needed to narrow the deficit. All right, as I said before, I'm jumping here to the table on page 25, showing the breakdown of what the Ann Arbor campus will need in order to go full solo. In order for them to operate independently of Concordia University of Wisconsin. I apologize for the format of this table. I was trying to get it to move around with not a lot of success. Also, ignore my chicken scratch in red. I will address that when I address this first topic of personnel. Before I do that, though, again, this table on page 25 is, as the title says, is a tabular summary of additional infrastructure and support for freestanding CUAA institution. Below that is the table, and below the table is a list with red letters on one side, and each of the red letters corresponds to black text on the other side. The red letters we can see are for different spots for the different categories and the different amounts for those categories. The black text that corresponds to that red letter is just additional information. Again, this is the public-facing report, so we don't know if there's additional details that we don't know that we wouldn't know because this is the redacted report. How much is in the unredacted report that isn't in this one, we don't know. Usually an institution will release the financials so that people that are voting or people that are funding them have an idea of where the institution is. Usually those tend to be, at least as at face value, those tend to be the most honest part of any report. In the chart itself, across the top, we see the following categories: staff administrative positions, recruitment and marketing, development, professional services, IT-related costs, parentheses, software and other licenses, end parentheses, accreditation expenses, total additional operating expenses, capital maintenance, parentheses, total, end parentheses, capital maintenance, parentheses, annual, end parentheses, total over 3 years, end parentheses. And then finally, the total. In the vertical column, we see the following categories: personnel, internal operating expenses, and under internal operating expenses, we see the following subcategories: advertising/subscriptions and IT operating. Next category is external consultants/service providers. After that is technology, with the subcategories software-related expenses and technology infrastructure. Next category, capital investments, with the subcategories roofing, building improvements, grounds improvements. First up, for personnel, staff administration positions. Again, that is at $1 million. The red letter A next to it corresponds to the A below, where it says an assumption of $100,000 for the 10 following positions: president, CFO, provost, VP enrollment, director of FA, Title IX dean of students, controller, registrar, OIE staff, parentheses, 2, end parentheses. Again, that's a huge liability, just combining Title IX with the dean of students. Moving on. Under recruitment and marketing, we see $375,000 listed in the personnel section. The red letter B corresponds to that, and below it reads, positions include marketing manager, graphics design, social media, marketing communications, etc. So assuming that they only want those four positions that have been listed as of present, that roughly comes to $93,750 per person. Again, if they only stick with those 4 that they listed. Continuing, underneath that, next to the red B1, is the number 45,000, where it's listed advertising/subscriptions. Below that, B1 says subscriptions for various marketing initiatives and advertising spent, parentheses, primarily online outlets, end parentheses. Next up, we have development, where personnel, again, back to personnel, we have the number $200,000 listed. Red letter C is next to it. Below that, red letter C says 2 advancement staff. Note, IT costs related to development operations are assumed to be included in the software and other leases category. Next up, professional services. They have the number $50,000 listed next to the category external consultants / service providers with a red letter D. Underneath that, D reads financial statement and other audit services. Next up, IT-related costs. First, under personnel, we have the number $950,000 with the red letter E. Red letter E reads, staffing positions include IT department leadership, networking director, audio/visual staff, system administrators, academic computing, etc. Next up, we have the number $50,000 listed for IT operating with the red E1 next to it. Below that, E1 reads, recognition of marginal expenses associated with operating an independent IT department. Side note, 50,000 seems kind of low as a number if that's supposed to be marginal expenses. Anyway, continuing underneath that, we have the number $400,000 for external consultants / service providers with the red E2 next to it. Below that, E2 reads professional services to support campus systems. Further down, we have the number 1.5 million that's in the subcategory software-related expenses with the red E3 next to it. Below that, E3 reads expenses associated with software and hardware necessary to operate Banner independently, parentheses, including cloud infrastructure, etc., and parentheses, Blackboard, Banner, parking systems, Oracle, etc. Underneath that, we have the number 800,000, which is listed in the subcategory technology infrastructure with a red E4 next to it. Below that, E4 reads expenses associated with the maintenance and repair of cloud infrastructure, networking systems, and other non-capitalizable IT equipment / supplies. I apologize for mispronouncing non-capitalizable. I'm just trying to get through this. Finances is not my strong suit. Next up, accreditation expenses. The number $50,000 is in the category external consultants / service providers with the red letter F next to it. Red F says includes base accreditation fees as well as travel / hospitality related expenses. Next category where it says total additional operating expenses, it has a red 1 above it, which I circled because, again, they did not account for this increase that LIMOS wants for their theological faculty. An additional campus pastor also isn't figured out in these stats either. Again, if this is something they want, they should be able to provide the numbers for it. It has a red 1 above it, but I don't see anything in this table of contents or later on in the report that corresponds to this red 1. The total additional operating expenses that they have listed for personnel is $2,525,000. For internal operating expenses, the subcategories advertising has $45,000 listed. IT operating has $50,000 listed. Then for the category external consultants / service providers, $500,000 is listed. Then for the technology subcategories, software related expenses is listed $1.5 million, and technology infrastructure is listed at $800,000. The total at the end of that category is $5,420,000. And at the far right end of the graph, we see those same numbers that I just read as the totals. Now, between total additional operating expenses and total, we have two other categories. The next one says capital maintenance, parentheses total, end parentheses, with a red letter G above it. Now, G is noted here below as capital projects that were deemed to be necessary in the near term, parentheses fiscal year 25 through 27, end parentheses. This cost was annualized to add to total additional operating expenses. Below that, we have the numbers under the subcategories, under capital investments, subcategories, roofing. We have G1 in red, next to the number 500,000. Below that, G1 says cost associated with the repair of the gymnasium roof. Under the subcategory building improvements, we see $1,350,000 with the red G2 next to it. Below that, G2 reads, costs associated with the repair of various building systems that would be capitalizable, including fire alarms, elevators, etc. The next step, we have $250,000 under the subcategory grounds improvements, with a red G3 next to it. Below that, red G3 reads, costs associated with the repair of campus grounds that would be capitalizable. Moving on to the next category. Capital maintenance, parentheses, annual, and parentheses, etc., that has a red 2 next to it. That has no numbers listed in the immediate category, except at the way, way bottom, where it says 700,000. Again, that 700,000 isn't associated with any particular category. It's just at the way, way bottom of the screen. And it's not the total of capital maintenance either, because capital maintenance's total is $2.1 million. Now, above the category of total, we do see that it has the red numbers 1 and 2 with a plus sign in between the two of them, which is how they get to the total figure of $6,120,000. However, there's no additional explanation for those numbers. All right, now that we covered page 25 and all of its amazing financial details, we're going back to where we left off on page 22. Because CUAA is operating at a deficit, increasing revenues and expenses by the same rate simply yields a widening deficit. Thus, a combination of increased revenue and decreased expenses would be needed to narrow the deficit. Options for increased revenue include: point 1, increase in net tuition dollars. If CUAA were able to increase net tuition revenue by an extra 3%, parentheses, beyond the assumed 5% annual increase, end parentheses, this would generate in current dollars approximately $500,000 in the first year and a total of $1.6 million over 3 years. Any tuition increase would need to be balanced against loss of enrollment if tuition becomes less affordable. Point 2, occupational therapy / physical therapy / physician assistant programs. CUAA continues to enroll students in occupational therapy / physical therapy and physician assistant programs. If fully enrolled to the maximum capacity of North Campus facilities, parentheses, requiring a substantial increase in enrollment in some programs, end parentheses, and if full enrollment could be maintained, these programs could generate, in current dollars, up to an additional $3.2 million per year in net tuition revenue after the cost of adding additional instructional staff. Point 3, international students. Increased enrollment of international students has been an increasingly popular means of driving revenue at both public and private institutions. However, international student populations require significant additional staffing to support logistics, language, and other needs, impacting the revenue margin. Also, international events can impact enrollment unexpectedly. Side note, I think that's just the short way of saying war between Russia and Ukraine and what's currently going on over in Israel, that can all impact enrollment. And that's not including any other major world events right now. Those are the two that I can list off the top of my head. Part of me does wonder, though, how many students they expected to come over and then it got abruptly interrupted because of those world events. Part of me is curious what that percentage would look like. Moving on. Point 4. Contracted housing. Because there is no capital available for new construction, CUAA could engage a private firm to finance and operate new residence halls. This could help increase enrollment by offering updated housing options at no cost to CUAA, parentheses, other than a contribution of land, end parentheses. However, the revenue to CUAA from privately operated housing would be minimal in the near future because most of the housing fees would be collected by the private operator. New housing could also allow CUAA to take existing housing, quote, offline, end quote, if it requires significant capital projects. That would lessen the renovation budget, but would also end the revenue stream from the existing CUAA-owned housing. Point 5. New academic programs. CUAA could attempt to develop new and/or online programs, including higher margin graduate programs. New programs, however, require an investment in startup costs for several years before generating revenue, and programs in popular areas face competition from larger and better funded institutions. In light of the decline in student population in the states nearest CUAA, even maintaining existing enrollment levels will be challenging, let alone driving growth. Point 6. Development. CUAA would need a major increase in donations even if all of the above items could be implemented. Point 7. More intensive use of campus facilities to generate revenue year-round. Options for cutting expenses include Point 1. Academic program cuts. Because CUAA is already fairly leanly staffed, it would actually have to add staffing, parentheses, as discussed above, end parentheses, to operate independently. There is relatively little excess faculty and staff unless CUAA were to eliminate entire programs to allow reductions in force for related faculty and staff. Valparaiso. I have a question on how to say that correctly. Side note, when I'm looking up that university, it comes up as a private university in Valparaiso, Indiana, and it's an independent Lutheran university with 5 colleges. The short version is Valpo. You know what? We'll go with Valpo. Valpo recently announced such cutbacks to a wide variety of programs. The savings would depend on how deeply CUAA chose to cut, recognizing that some students will also leave if their preferred programs are not available. Point 2. Athletic program cuts. CUAA has driven enrollment growth in recent years through a rapid increase in athletic programs. As noted above, these programs come at a cost for staffing and operational expenses, $5.2 million in fiscal year 2023. CUAA could eliminate some of the most costly programs, recognizing, however, that this would also results in loss of students who enroll due to the ability to participate in a particular sport. Section. Increased enrollment/enrollment management discussion. CUAA has experienced growth in its undergraduate student population, contrary to the general trend of declining undergraduate enrollment at many institutions, parentheses, including CUW, end parentheses. However, despite this growth, the net deficit has not decreased. tuition revenue and expenses have grown at roughly the same rate. The additional students are not generating marginal, quote, profit, end quote, towards the operating cost of CUAA. A significant driver of enrollment has been growth of the student-athlete population. CUAA athletic programs carry significant costs for recruiting, coaching, travel, and other expenses, roughly $5.2 million in fiscal year 2023, which is nearly 19% of total CUAA annual expenses. Thus, the athletic growth has not helped the bottom line. Because residence halls are already at capacity, the new students do not generate significant auxiliary revenue from dorm occupancy. Rosters for the programs are at capacity, so it is not possible to continue to increase the student-athlete population unless new sports can be launched. Additionally, with large roster numbers, not all students achieve their desired playing time, which can lead to, quote, churn, end quote, where students drop out or transfer to other institutions. This has a negative impact on the university's overall student retention and graduation rates as publicly reported. Students who leave must be replaced, requiring additional recruiting time and expense. Enrollment management is a delicate science. Students with higher academic profiles are in demand, and thus they tend to qualify for higher levels of scholarship assistance, reducing the amount of net tuition. Students with lower academic profiles, on the other hand, may require remedial courses, individualized tutoring, and academic counseling to ensure that they reach their full academic potential and succeed in college. International students may need similar assistance navigating U.S. culture, immigration and financial issues, and academics. These support services are an increased cost to the institution, which also impacts revenue and expenses. Institutions can grow any student population through tuition discounting, co-curricular or athletic programming, more international students, and/or more open enrollment standards. But this growth comes at a cost in a time of student scarcity. The current enrollment management at CUAA has emphasized growth through athletics, but this balance has not helped the bottom line. Next section, additional specific questions and responses. The subcommittee was also specifically directed by the Board of Regents to, point 1, assess the ability and willingness of the Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and English districts of the LCMS, as well as the Michigan Church Extension Fund, and other identified funding partners/donors to support the Ann Arbor campus financially, enabling it to function within a sustainable financial model. In the first week of April, the subcommittee contacted the Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana district presidents, the English district bishop, the LCMS Board of Directors, the Concordia University System Board, and the Michigan District Extension Fund to determine A, whether and to what extent each entity would be willing to make an initial, quote, launch, end quote, contribution toward an independent CUAA by December 31st, 2024, and B, whether and to what extent each entity would be willing to commit to ongoing annual support for an independent CUAA. Per the resolution, other CUS schools were not approached to serve as financial partners for the Ann Arbor campus. The Michigan District, which led a widely publicized effort to solicit pledges in support of CUAA, has advised that it has received $3,675,000 in pledges and a commitment from its board of directors of $125,000 from the district budget, subject in each case to certain contingencies, for 1 year of operational support for CUAA without a commitment for future years. The Indiana district reported that, quote, we would not feel comfortable committing to anything until there is some, quote, hard data, end quote, and a firm plan in place demonstrating a reasonable indication of ongoing sustainability, end overall quote. The LCMS Board of Directors reported that funding is not available per board policy determination. To date, the subcommittee has not received a response from the remaining districts and entities that were contacted. Point 2. Assess the ability of groups related to the Ann Arbor campus to create an escrow fund of $10 million before the submission of the subcommittee's report. In light of the responses to the previous question, the subcommittee does not believe that an escrow fund of $10 million can be created to secure the launch of CUAA as an independent campus. Point 3. Recommend an expeditious timeline for the Ann Arbor campus to achieve self-governance within CUS guidelines, while permitting CUW to divest itself of financial obligation and responsibility. The Board of Regents determined that the initial launch plan for an independent CUAA should have immediate effect and should cover the next 3 academic years, 2024 to 2025, 2025 to 2026, and 2026 to 2027. Accordingly, the subcommittee report is based on that timeline. Next up, here on page 26, we have the Property and Legal Subcommittee report. Section: General Direction and Included Scope. The Property and Legal Subcommittee of the CUWAA Task Force was asked to research and assess issues related to the current Ann Arbor campus property becoming a standalone institution of higher education in the Concordia University system. Section: Excluded Scope. The subcommittee did not consider any models related to the transition from a traditional residential campus to an exclusive virtual or online education institution. Section: General Property Information. Concordia University Ann Arbor, main campus, 4090 Geddes Road, Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County, Michigan, 48105. IRR Detroit file number 142-2024-0135. February 2024 value: $17.8 million. This overall property contains approximately 275,238 square feet of building area. The majority of the campus building improvements were constructed in 1963, excepting the historic residence constructed in 1936 and the athletic field house constructed in 2015. The campus includes 30 buildings of mixed academic buildings, residence halls, athletic facilities, and support services with an area of 135.61 acres. Concordia University Ann Arbor, North Campus, 3475 Plymouth Road, Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County, Michigan, 48105. IRR-Detroit file number 142-2024-0178. February 2024 value: $10 million. The property contains 85,728 square feet of gross leasable area. The improvements were constructed in 1964 and recently renovated in 2016. The site area is 9.58 acres. Next section: Summary. The subcommittee included the following items in our document review: an April 5, 2024 memorandum from the legal firm Hush Blackwell regarding the 2013 updated reversionary clause. Point: the updated reversionary clause is effectuated only in the event both institutions conclude operation and dissolve. No longer serving as educational or religious institutions. Only in that instance would the property revert to the LCMS. Otherwise, the 4090 Geddes Road and 3475 Plymouth Road properties remain the fiduciary responsibility of the CUWAA Board of Regents. A review of the LCMS bylaws relating to synodical property in universities. Point: a careful review of the 2023 LCMS handbook identified 6 specific bylaws pertaining to property. It is the opinion of the subcommittee that any action needed by the LCMS Board of Directors would take significant time. Therefore, it is recommended that 2 years be included in any property plans related to the Ann Arbor campuses. A lease with the Michigan District of the LCMS. Point. On August 21st, 1964, a 99-year lease was signed between Concordia Lutheran Junior College, parentheses, now CUWAA, end parentheses, and the Michigan District for a 10-acre parcel for the purposes of building a district office. Next section, recommendation. To function as an independent residential campus, the existing Ann Arbor campus property would need to be maintained in its current configuration. It is reasonable for Concordia University Incorporated, parentheses, CU, Inc., end parentheses, to recover fair market property and equipment value during the creation of a standalone institution of higher education. Therefore, the subcommittee recommends a land contract between CU Inc. and the independent CUAA. This will ensure the exchange retains the property under the bylaws of the LCMS. Option 1, entire campus. Note that was in bold. The recommended land contract would include both Ann Arbor properties and all the current buildings, equipment, furnishings, and accoutrements. All maintenance and capital improvements would be the responsibility of CUAA and would be included in any reversionary, forfeiture, or default clauses of the contract. Terms: $25 million at 5% amortized over 30 years equals $134,205 a month, or $1.6 million a year. CU Inc. would establish an escrow account to receive payments and would be unable to use the revenue until the conclusion of the contract or forfeiture. In the event CUAA ceases operation or forfeits on payments, the property and the escrow account would revert to CU Inc. In bold, option 2, 4090 Geddes Road, parentheses, main campus, end parentheses, end bold. The recommended land contract would include the 135.61 acre parcel with the existing buildings, equipment, furnishings, and accoutrements. All maintenance and capital improvements would be the responsibility of CUAA and would be included in any reversionary, forfeiture, or default clauses of the contract. Terms: $18 million at 5% amortized over 30 years. 30 is also in parentheses as a number. That equals out to $96,627.89 a month, or $1,159,524 a year. CU Inc. would establish an escrow account to receive payments and would be unable to use the revenue until the conclusion of the contract or forfeiture. In the event CUAA ceases operation or forfeits on payments, the property and the escrow account would revert to CU Inc. CUW would retain the North Campus, permitting the located graduate programs to continue with their related accreditations. Next section, Michigan District Lease. For the sake of good order and in support of the work of the Michigan District, the subcommittee recommends that representatives of Concordia University, Wisconsin, meet with the president and the business manager of the Michigan District of the LCMS within 3 months of the closing of that district's triennial convention. The intent will be to review and discuss any items or needs related to the lease of the 10-acre parcel. Next up, here on page 28, we have the Mission Subcommittee Report. The CUWAA Board of Regents authorized a task force in March of 2024 charged with, quote, exploring the ing is in its own separate parentheses, the possibility of CUAA returning to autonomous status as a standalone university within the Concordia University system, end quote. The mission subcommittee consists of Reverend Mark Braden, parentheses, chair, end parentheses, Reverend David Davis, Reverend David Fleming, Reverend Dr. Aaron Moldenhauer, Reverend Dr. Ryan Peterson, and Reverend Dr. Richard Stuckwish. This group conducted its analysis by reviewing documents attesting to Lutheran identity and mission on the Ann Arbor campus and by conducting a visit of the campus on April 25th through 26, 2024. This report summarizes the committee's findings as they carried out their assignment to, quote, assess the ability of CUAA to meet LCMS CUS LIMOS standards, etc., end quote. Side note, that is a lot of acronyms. Last time I read that many acronyms in that kind of sentence, I was reading state documents. I guess the LCMS just wanted to be hip with the kids. The subcommittee recognizes that the LIMOS are newly revised by Synod and just beginning to be used in their present form for campus visitations by the CUS board. Side note, I was reading out the acronym LIMOS to my partner, and he thought that with the acronym LIMOS that it was almost a special category of the DMV. Seriously, I bet the people of the Lutheran Identity and Mission Outcome Standards had a great time figuring out their acronym, and all power to them. It's just really hilarious that it sounds like a special category of vehicles. But I guess they had to come up with something relatively cool just so that people would take their visitations with not as much trepidation as they probably should. When they say that the LIMOS are newly revised by Synod and just beginning to be used in their present form for campus visitations, that makes me think that this is going to become a witch hunt of sorts. And I say that knowing and having all due respect for previous witch hunt survivors. I don't mean that in any sort of jest. And I don't say it lightly. It seems like there's a perception that the LCMS leadership has where it needs to be more above and beyond LCMS, that it needs to have its identity checked, that if they don't get a handle on it soon, somehow, some way, in some shape or form, that people are going to mistake them as anything that's not LCMS. Usually when there's a focus on rebranding, there's usually a hunt that goes on because people want to have someone that they can blame for not being as on board with brand in XYZ way. Especially since this is in a religious context, I am very concerned. Precisely because religion can be used to justify any number of bad behaviors. I could be wrong, and I want to stress that point that I could be wrong. But just reading this part out, that is what it seems to me. If there's something that I should take into additional consideration, please let me know, link it down in the comments down below, or reach out to me at my email, which will be in the description. I continue reading. Accordingly, it recognizes that the LIMOS have not been deployed as an instrument at CUAA to date. Also, I want to note on screen, I have in a red text box the Lutheran Identity and Mission Outcome Standards, parentheses, LIMOS, and parentheses, noting that the acronym was originally drawn out on page 12. Section, Summary Conclusions. The overarching conclusion of the committee is that there are many positive indications of Lutheran mission and identity on the Ann Arbor campus. While the campus is decidedly Christian in identity, the committee finds that the campus would require time and resources to implement the LIMOS and build Lutheran identity on the campus. Specifically, in terms of personnel, the committee recommends a chief mission officer and an additional campus pastor. These positions would work to strengthen campus worship and ministry, and to develop staff and faculty to grow into a deeper understanding of and living out of Lutheran theology. Parentheses, ecclesiology, sacramentology, fellowship, and parentheses, as they carry out the mission. Side note, this sounds really familiar to their earlier statement of they want a chief mission officer and an additional campus pastor, and they also want to increase the theology faculty on campus. But they didn't want to provide the numbers of what that would cost. Also, the categories that they list for living out of Lutheran theology, ecclesiology, sacramentology, and fellowship, those all sound like potentially things you could either minor in or major in as a student. They must think that there's enough there where that's something that needs to be studied and lived out of. But then there's a concern that by having this focus be on your outward presentation, that is going to encourage a lot of judgmental finger wagging and shaming. There's going to be a lot more stress on the faculty and staff of the campus because they're not going to be seen as LCMS abiding as other people on campus. I don't know why LCMS thinks that this is a good idea to implement, considering that you could potentially have a whole lot more staff turnover if you turn your place into a potentially culty workplace. Anyway, I continue reading. There is a further need to add to the theology faculty. Oh, here we go. The committee envisions a 4 to 5 year trajectory of growth in these areas, with the LIMOS serving as a formative tool in order for CUAA to have a CUS board visit that finds them fulfilling the LIMOS. Oh, good grief. Not only are you trying to force faculty and staff to grow further in Lutheran theology and apparently also their outward appearance so that they look more LCMS than just generic Christian, you also want to have this be the golden standard for further follow-up. Yeah, this is just screaming super culty to me. Like, I would understand it if it was for a church and you didn't think the church was preaching LCMS, because when you have a church, that's a religious body, and the religious body needs to be adhering to your religious standards. I can understand that. This is a college campus we're talking about. A college campus that is supposed to not only host a number of programs and as we know, athletic programs just to help balance the books or attempt to balance the books, but is also not even majority Lutheran. You want to turn this college into a majority Lutheran campus, and it sounds like you're willing to do some pretty unethical things, even by your own standards. Unless, of course, your standards include just forming a committee and forcing everybody to adhere to that committee without regard of what their position is and what their position is meant to look like in real life. I mean, if your organization is meant to, or sees their life goal to be reenacting the Salem witch trials, just the LCMS version of the Salem witch trials, you go right ahead. I'll be here to snark on it. I continue reading. The strength of the campus is a close community of individuals who care passionately about Jesus and the university. The weakness is a shallow understanding of Lutheran mission and identity that equates evangelization with Lutheran mission and identity. Side note, I highlighted this section along with the parts of the previous section in yellow because I was hoping that it wouldn't get worse, and the more that I read it and reread it, I kept seeing that it kept getting worse and worse. Again, college campus. Just because your college campus is affiliated with the LCMS doesn't mean that you're going to help balance the books or be a productive campus by enacting a crackdown and only allowing LCMS students to continue being students. I know that they don't say that they want students who aren't LCMS students to leave, but they're not giving any sort of indication that they're going to consider or be tolerant of other people's, in this case, other students' religious freedoms. And this is especially important if they have been tolerant of other students, other religions, including other forms of Christianity on campus. So then students will be confused, as will faculty and staff, as to why you're enacting a crackdown and why you're trying to force non-LCMS students to join the LCMS. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. Are you going to make it a graduating requirement that these students join the LCMS, that they profess to not just be Christian but also Lutheran because that's your best version of Christianity? And again, this all goes back to how well you can act this out in real life. Outward performance. It's all based on your outward performance. And if you can't outwardly perform your Lutheran identity enough, that means that your job could potentially be in complete jeopardy. I continue reading. While it is clear to the committee that the campus is Christian, it is less clear that it is distinctively Lutheran as defined by the LIMOS. Efforts, particularly development of personnel, would be needed to build from a clear Christian identity to a distinctively Lutheran identity. Side note, again, this is all going back to outward performance. And it definitely feels like it's an attempt to crack down. I continue reading. The remainder of this report comments on the individual limos as an example of a report that would follow a CUS board visit of the campus using this instrument. These details support the snapshot of the campus's current state of mission and identity as well as the path forward laid out above. Okay, now I'm going to, as a side note, focus more on the other problems that this brings up. Limo sounds like a relatively new invention of the LCMS governing body. It sounds like it's relatively new. With it being relatively new, not a lot of people are understandably going to know a lot about it or what their goals are. The problem when you roll out something that new and have them weigh in on something as serious and having as much gravity as this report that is determining whether or not a college is stable enough to go out on their own as a separate, unique college and not underneath another college's administration, you are setting the tone for that entire committee going forward. You are also setting the public perception of that committee going forward. And right now, I don't blame anyone if their public perception of LIMOS is negative, because their whole objective in this report so far is that they're determining how Lutheran a campus is or not, or how Lutheran staff and faculty appear to be or not. Again, this seems like a witch hunt, and I apologize to the LIMOS members if that wasn't their intent. However, intent is one thing, and how things are written and communicated are completely different. If you were there to just help maybe promote LCMS versus just a generic Christian identity, that would be something completely different. But no, every word here, every phrase here screams that you don't think that people have a good enough understanding of your LCMS doctrines and theology, and you want to fix that. You want to fix them. There is no way that any sensible person reading this isn't going to come away with the impression that this is just going to be a witch hunt with potentially a crackdown, and you could potentially lose a lot of students in the process. I don't know also if this was intended to make it into the public section, or if because this is assumption. The way I'm reading this is essentially their grand reveal of LIMOS, and they're also using them as an example that would follow the board visit of any Concordia campus, any campus that's associated with the LCMS. They could potentially have this kind of board visit and have LIMOS visit, and what we're seeing right now is just an example of the report that they would give. And that should be a lot more concerning to everyone who's in the LCMS. Section Identity Standard 1, Ecclesiastical Mission and Goals. CUAA has a mission statement that is Christ-centered and aims the university to prepare students for service in the world. An independent CUAA would need to develop its own mission statement, values, etc. Conversations with constituents make evident a strong heart for evangelization and a zeal for bringing people to Christ. This heart for the lost is laudable, but the campus would need to work to develop further evidence beyond successful evangelism efforts that it is meeting the mission and identity objectives laid out by the CUS. Evidence for areas of strength. Point 1. Students, staff, faculty emphasize the evangelism opportunities on campus. Point 2. Many spoke of specific instances of students whom the Lord brought to faith at CUAA. 3. Many spoke of the importance of being a Christ-centered institution. Evidence for areas of growth. Point 1. Building a mission statement would take time and resources. It would include board representation as well as key leaders from faculty and staff. Side note, I would hazard a guess that they already have the mission statement they want to see from from Concordia University and Arbor, and they already have an idea of who in faculty and staff would be on board with it and who wouldn't be. Usually when they have this objective of building a mission statement, they already have in mind what it should look like, and they already have in mind too who on the faculty and staff would be their biggest supporters. So it's not a question of how to fix it, it's a question of when to fix it. Point 2. Continue reading. A current lack of attention to the LIMOS shows that implementing the LIMOS as a formative tool would take time and resources. Side note, I'm pretty sure you would get a lot more attention if you were actually in limos driving to and from the campus just to show off how cool you are and how much better you were than everybody else. If that sounds too on the nose, then maybe you should rethink your purpose in life. Now, in addition to that, also, I feel at this point I'm going to be restating what I said before a lot. When I was initially preparing to record this video, I was fairly confident that there was going to be a lot for me to snark on, and as I was preparing and doing more and getting more feedback from my partner, it seems like a lot of what I'm going to be saying is going to be repeating myself, which I do apologize for that. That is not my intention. In this particular case, the LCMS is making it very easy because of how they're implementing their new task force to go to this university, how they're publicly showing that they're implementing this task force. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors. We just know that this is, as far as they're telling us, the first real implementation of LIMOS. And again, it really seems like they're just trying to do a crackdown and trying to make Ann Arbor heel to the LCMS LIMOS ways. This just gets more concerning every time I read this. For this particular point, too, it seems like they didn't really think about what all would be required to implement what their ideal Lutheran LIMOS standards would take, what that implementation would look like, what all would be needed to get people on board with it. It feels like they didn't really think it through. I continue reading. Point 3. Similarly, future self-reporting and assessment with the CUS would need to prioritize the LIMOS as markers of Lutheran identity and mission. So now, not only are you going to force the campus to initially adhere to your LIMOS standards, you're going to make sure that your special little inquisition-y assessment team will need to be utilized in the future by forcing them to come back and reevaluate. Is that every year? Is it every 6 months? Is it every 2 years? They don't say here, and that is also concerning. Continuing on, point 4, there is a paucity of Lutheran symbols, parentheses, crucifixes, creedal statements, etc., end parentheses, on campus. Okay, If anybody has ever attended Fox Valley Lutheran High School, I think or I hope that this makes sense, but essentially, in every, at least when I attended, almost every single classroom had a crucifix, which is basically Jesus hanging on the cross, hanging on the wall somewhere in the classroom. If they needed ideas, they could really just, hop on over to the Wells side of things and say, hey, we'd like to get some inspiration from you. Personally, I don't know what they mean by symbols when they also include symbols as including creedal statements. What exactly are they trying to achieve? Are they trying to just get these things printed out on parchment that looks like it's from the Middle Ages or something like that, and then just have the creedal statements on there for everybody to see, and that's supposed to fix everything? Is it, or do they just want it to be written on the walls in one classroom, in the hallway, in every single classroom, in offices? I'm really confused what they're looking for when they say there's a paucity of Lutheran symbols, because usually if you think that there's a scarcity of something, you have an idea of how to fix it. I want to know what their idea is for fixing it. Next section, Identity Standard 2, Spiritual and Academic Life. The curriculum for undergraduates and graduates includes an integration of faith and learning. Academic classes help students incorporate faith into their future career plans. There are good efforts underway to deepen faculty understanding of Lutheran theology and incorporation of that theology in the classroom. On screen, you'll see that I have had that section highlighted. I continue reading. Chapel worship demonstrates the need to grow in a lived confession of sacramental theology and liturgical understanding. The campus has been blessed with opportunities to bring people to baptism, but needs to grow in how these baptisms bring converts into Christ's church. Please note, I also highlighted that section on screen. An emphasis on relations allows the campus pastor to minister to students, but runs the risk of elevating the office holder above the office. See confidential appendix. I have see confidential appendix underlined in red. And as you can see on screen, a whole bunch of notes written in red in the margins. Okay, so let's go back over that section. They essentially say that they're happy that they're able to get people baptized into the Christian faith, but they don't really see it as the Christian faith because they're not bringing them into LCMS. Because otherwise they wouldn't use the phrase, needs to grow in how these baptisms bring converts into Christ's church. Excuse you. Maybe they found a non-denominational church down the street that they wanted to attend. Maybe they wanted to go into Catholicism a little bit. I don't know, and frankly, I don't care, and I don't understand why you feel like you should care. You baptize the person. You help bring them to faith. You believe that baptism brings them to faith. I don't understand why you think you can be so frickin' pretentious about this. Except that probably like the Wells, you feel like you can be because you're the only true Christian church on earth. Good grief. Yeah, notes close to that sentence I have written, not a cult. Yeah, definitely not a cult, guys. They want to bring you to the Christian faith, but it doesn't count unless it's the LCMS Christian faith. Oh boy, this kind of nonsense is rampant in the Wells too. I don't want to make it seem like it's just an LCMS issue, but it's it's definitely a denominational issue too. And then next thing I want to point out is note where that is in the paragraph. They're happy about the classes showing students how to incorporate their faith, talking about efforts that are underway to deepen the faculty understanding of Lutheran theology and how to incorporate that. They don't like chapel worship because apparently it doesn't demonstrate that they're growing in a lived confession of sacramental theology and liturgical understanding, which doesn't make sense if the majority of the students aren't LCMS in origin. And we're very close to that point. We're very close to that. Also, so far, their biggest complaint is still that not enough people are joining the LCMS. Still. Like, yes, they big mad about theology. They big mad about the people being baptized and not coming to faith on campus, or not coming to their faith on campus. I didn't realize Christianity could be so exclusionary. Like, oh yeah, you did get baptized, but did you get baptized in our synod? If you didn't, well then you're not legitimately Christian. Also, the other thing that they're emphasizing is that they like that the campus pastor ministers to students and has that ability and freedom to do so, but they're concerned about it elevating the office holder above the office. That poor campus pastor. He is in a catch-22 situation. Please note I am saying he because the LCMS doesn't allow women pastors. But that poor pastor, he is in a catch-22 situation. He is just doing his best to minister to the students as he can with being very severely underpaid, might I point out yet again. And you are more concerned about the potential that him being elevated up above the office. You're more concerned that people might hold him. To me, this is what it reads like. It reads like they're more concerned about people forming close relationships with the campus pastor and being in such a good relationship with a campus pastor that they grow close, they grow friendly, they know each other on a first name basis, and they trust the campus pastor. And they want to bring in a new campus pastor because they don't like how familiar the current campus pastor is with everyone on campus. But they don't phrase it that way because then it sounds like more obvious that they're witch hunting and that they're head hunting and that they want to get rid of people who aren't fully 100% LCMS. So they're looking to replace him with a different campus pastor. Keep in mind, this is all my personal opinion. It's just, this is how it reads to me. And I get that vibe even more so when I see the words "see confidential appendix" after it. There is something that they didn't like that really stuck in their craw when they went on campus to do their evaluation. And they really, really, really don't like that campus pastor. But they don't have a good reason for getting rid of him, like he's not doing his job. No, they don't like him for probably some small, minor, petty reasons, and they want to replace him. And they're more concerned with him having those close relationships and being harder to replace than they are with maybe taking a step back and asking, maybe we should reprioritize. No, I guess that's just impossible for them. Continuing reading, evidence for areas of strength. Point 1. On a regular basis, students seek out baptism while at CUAA. A couple questions that were brought up. Is it required that you be baptized in order to participate in sports, in order to participate in extracurriculars? Is it required that you get baptized before you graduate? Or is it completely on your own thing? Point 2, athletic teams have a regular schedule of chapel attendance. Side note again, is this required? If it's required, I don't know how laudable it really should be. Point 3, the Faith and Vocation Seminar is a good piece of faculty development for mission. My partner brought up, but is it LIMOS approved? Is it the LIMOS mission? Yeah, and also I would like to add, is it required for faculty? And then how does that seminar get developed? Who is in charge of developing it? Will that change? Point 4, continuing on, the core curriculum for undergraduates requires 3 theology courses. Point 5, students speak to the value of considering their future careers through the lens of vocation. All right, evidence for areas of growth. Point 1, a chapel service on April 27th included a lector who is outside the fellowship of the LCMS. Side note, that was considered so obviously petty by my partner. They did not like, while they were on campus, the fact that someone was outside the fellowship of the LCMS that came to campus and led a chapel service. Unless the word lector here means that they were just reading a section of scripture, in which case that's even more petty, because you're now big mad at someone who just came to visit your campus and you really don't like that they're reading a section of scripture and that they're allowed to do it, and that they're outside the LCMS and that the LCMS, I guess, didn't do enough of a good job verifying their credentials? Question mark? It's, if that is the only chapel service where that happened, I don't know what to tell. I don't know what to tell you, except that they were really being petty and really trying to find reasons to justify the LIMO's existence. Point 2, continuing on, chapel services evidence a lack of understanding of how various liturgical components, parentheses, e.g., invocation, opening versicles, end parentheses, function in the service. Okay, side note, I'm definitely a layperson here, but if you're mad at someone for not following something that was liturgically set down by your synod, you can, not that it's not that you can't bring it up, because you can definitely bring it up and have that conversation, but we're going to need to see some examples here. What they do, have the invocation at the end of service, have the opening versicles in the middle of service. Usually, at least when I was in the Wells, whenever people would complain about liturgical components not being used correctly, they would usually be complaining because something wasn't done in the exact right way that they were used to it being done. But instead of being adults and talking it over with the pastor, they would just bitch about it behind the pastor's back. Or if there was an attempt at a worship team before people inevitably decided that they didn't like how secular the worship team was and that should be abandoned. If the worship team did something like that, they would never address the worship team. They just gossip about the worship team until they were forced to leave or resign or something along those lines. Moving on, point 3. Students lead a prayer immediately following chapel in a different location on campus. The purpose of this in relation to chapel needs to be explored. Side note, that led to the question, was the chapel that bad? Did they have to lead a prayer following the chapel saying, "Dear God, please forgive us for sitting through that chapel because that wasn't an appropriate LCMS chapel"? Is the prayer more of a, well, now that we did the official service that was required of us, now we do more of a student-led, student-inspired prayer that is more in line with how the campus majority is in line with things? What's wrong with that? And why can't they elaborate? Unless they did, and that's in the confidential appendix. Oh, I want that confidential appendix. Point 4. The chapel should take care to avoid gestures and postures that confuse the role of the pastor and the laity. Side note, means he can't be hip with the kids. Point 5. Chapel services should grow in Lutheran sacramental theology, incorporating confession and absolution and demonstrating a greater focus on the proclamation of the word as the central focus of chapel. This feels like, to me, like they are rephrasing point 2. Just now getting into it because they didn't believe in putting more points under point 2 to be more specific. They just wanted to make another point so that the report was longer. I don't know. Moving on, point 6, the catechesis of baptismal candidates should be strengthened and ideally handed off to local congregations to facilitate the incorporation of the baptized into their new place in the congregation. Okay, side note here. Not only do they have this idea that baptismal candidates aren't passing the catechism test, they also want the candidates to be handed off to local congregations. I guess to also bolster their own congregation numbers in addition to bolstering their college numbers. First off, that is very culty. You want your local LCMS congregations to get a hold of all of the baptized. You want them. It's not even like, I know you use the word ideally here, but you want them. You want this to happen. Otherwise, you wouldn't use ideally and local congregations in the same sentence, as well as incorporation of the baptized into their new place in the congregation. This is a college that is a majority Christian college, but doesn't have the majority of the students as LCMS members. It's a college. It is not a seminary. It is not a church. Deal with the fact that other people will choose to go to other denominations. Moving on to point 7. Student understanding of Lutheran identity and theology is uneven. What, were you grading all these students? When you were on campus for those, I think, 3 days, were you just handing out tests and trying to grade students on what they understood of Lutheran identity and theology? And what, did they fail or did they pass and you just didn't like their answers? Next section, Identity Standard 3, Student Recruitment and Student Life. There are ongoing efforts to increase the Christian profile of the institution. The strength of these efforts is clear communication to incoming students about the Christian identity of the institution, along with renewed efforts to recruit Lutheran students. Faith is integrated into student life direction, policies, and training. The campus is making efforts to increase the low percentage of Lutherans in the student body. While athletics are clearly Christian, non-Lutheran coaches taking teams to visit non-Lutheran congregations confuses the Lutheran identity of the campus. Please note, I highlighted that section on screen here. this is incredible. This reads as incredibly passive aggressive. This, they are so upset. They are trying to, part of me wonders if LIMOS was an attempt to force everybody to adopt a more LCMS Lutheran identity because people were upset at non-Lutheran Christians being hired because they didn't have enough LCMS Lutherans to take their place. And then these non-Lutheran Christians are taking people to visit non-Lutheran congregations to give them more experience, to show them more of the world outside the little LCMS cloister, and people got big mad. But instead of being able to handle it like adults, they just went and created their own little institutions so that they could have a reason for suspending them, disciplining them, and potentially even firing them. Evidence for areas of strength. Continuing on, point 1. Admissions is prioritizing grassroots efforts with Lutheran churches and schools. These include regular visits to Lutheran and Christian high schools. Side note, you're not going to get the LCMS members you want if the tuition is going to be that expensive. I don't blame colleges for having expensive tuition, especially understanding the kind of infrastructure that they have to support. However, unless you have more financial support for these kids to even consider coming to your colleges, you're not going to get the LCMS turnout you want. Moving on, point 2. Clear messaging to prospective students on identity of the institution. Side note, apparently the messaging is great about the Lutheran identity of the institution when it comes to admissions, but it's everywhere else on campus that's at fault. Again, still screams passive-aggressive to me. Moving on to point 3, student life policies, training, and recruitment align with Lutheran identity. Evidence for areas of growth. Point 1. The student body is 18% Lutheran, 13% LCMS. I made a note here written on screen that says, what is the other 5% Wells Lutheran? Also, what is the percentage for faculty and staff? How many faculty and staff are Lutheran versus just Christian? As for that matter, how many of the student body is just generally Christian? But going back to that statistic, because I don't have answers to the questions that I just posed, the student body being 18% Lutheran, specifically 13% LCMS, means they're in the minority. And they've been in the minority probably for some time now. When you have an institution like a college that is about higher learning, that is about secondary education, that is about preparing you for more mind-intensive and sometimes physically and mentally intensive jobs, when you have programs that are for multiple different jobs that span multiple different career paths, and you only have 13% that is a specific denomination, that denomination is a minority. And that doesn't mean that you're doing anything bad with them being a minority. It just means that they are a minority. Now, with them being the minority, then the next question should be, well, should we make the rest of the campus forced to abide by the rules of the minority? Well, is the minority being discriminated against? Are they being punished in any way for being the minority? It doesn't sound like they are. So it sounds like everybody is currently having a nice time on campus, both Lutheran and non-Lutheran alike. Everybody is satisfied with what they're doing with their chosen career of study, chosen path of study, chosen field. They're looking forward to whatever else life has to bring them, and they're happy with what they currently are being offered and what is currently being offered to them. And that's And I'm not trying to make fun of that. That is something that is amazing. That's probably what everybody wishes that they could have when it comes to campus life, that everybody has a really good equilibrium. And they want to ruin that because there's not enough LCMS identifiers. Your college stopped being identifiably LCMS denomination Lutheran a while ago, and I don't think you'll ever be able to return to what you want it to be. Sorry, not sorry that I'm the one who has to tell you this. Just deal with it. Moving on to point 2. Non-Lutherans leading athletic prayers and devotions is an area to address. Again, it sounds like your campus stopped being specifically LCMS denomination a while ago. Don't be upset that there's other Christians that aren't Lutheran that are helping to fill in the gaps. Moving on, point 3. Team visits to non-denominational churches send a confusing message to students. Note again with the passive-aggressive language being used. Moving on, point 4. Student life staff is not clear on appropriate boundaries for programming that supports worship of other deities. I'm assuming that's because you don't like the worship of other deities and you want to squash that on campus. That will not work if you, and it sounds like you have been allowing the worship of other deities on campus. It sounds like in general you support the idea, if not the exact letter, of freedom of religion. And that's going to be a very hard thing to bounce back from if you think it is wise to try to reverse your previous decision on religious freedom of the students. Moving on. Next section, Identity Standard 4, Planning and Resourcing. Enrollment at CUAA has grown in recent years in spite of inferior facilities in parts of the campus. This is a testament to a strength of growing enrollment while also showing a need for increased funding for capital projects. Personnel decisions currently reside primarily with the executive team located in Mequon. An independent CUAA would need resources for capital projects and to develop its own leadership team. Evidence for areas of strength. Point 1. Human resources aligned with mission at present. Point 2. Careful mission fit work is being done when hiring. Evidence for areas of growth. Point 1. Expressed desire to build staff development programming to help deepen staff's understanding of Lutheran theology and identity. Side note, that is not the same as professional learning and professional education and professional re-education and professional certification. You just want your staff to align more closely with your LCMS Lutheran theology and identity. And apparently you think enough of them aren't that LCMS, and you want to fix that. I would say you want to fix them, but that is what I think you want to do, allegedly. Moving on to point 2. Largest budgets are building and grounds and athletics. Need to align budget with mission priorities. Point 3. An independent CUAA would need to develop its own strategic plan, leadership team, etc. Point 4. Need to build up the number of full-time faculty in the theology department. As my little red note reads here on screen, you still need the money and we still need the numbers because these faculty are going to cost something and that needs to be determined. Honestly, it's more surprising to me that they've been able to get this far in the report and there's still no question, there's still no understanding of, there's no numbers being presented of what the theology department, what these extra additions that they want to have added to the theology department, what to expect for that cost. And that is mind-blowing to me. Moving on, next section. Identity Standard 5, Governance, Leadership, and Administration. The subcommittee recognizes that an independent CUAA would need to build its own board of regents and call its own president. A new board and administration would show its commitment to Lutheran identity and mission and embrace its place in the LCMS. Keeping Lutheran identity and mission at the forefront while assembling such a board and administration would be key to success in this area. Next up, Identity Standard 6, Assessment and Effectiveness. Side note, this is the next section, second to last section. Currently, the Ann Arbor campus shares a mission statement and core values with the Mequon campus. An independent CUAA would need to develop its own ecclesiastical goals and metrics to assess them. The campus has a clear and laudable commitment to evangelism. This commitment should be paired with a primary mission of higher education in developing these. Working with CUS during its regular visitations would help an independent CUAA develop strong goals and metrics. Evidence for areas of strength, point 1. Note that this is the only point in this section. Students have powerful stories of the Lord working in their lives. Evidence for areas of growth, point 1. The LIMOS are just beginning to play a formative role in the institution. This will need to be strengthened. Side note, again, this seems to just confirm my earlier suspicions that LIMOS is here because it's a pet project of someone and they really wanted to justify their existence. And at this point, especially with this wording, Ann Arbor appears that it could be potentially the fall guy. If LIMOS decides that they don't like what Ann Arbor's doing, then they could potentially decide the fate of the Ann Arbor campus. And I don't think the LCMS honestly can afford that. Moving on to point 2. As the LIMOS come into play, the goals and metrics for measuring mission effectiveness should expand beyond evangelism. Next section. Identity Standard 8. Handling and resolving concerns of constituents. Side note, yes, as you see on screen, it is indeed number 8. It is not number 7, it is number 8. What happened to Identity Standard number 7? Either it got misnumbered as number 8 here, or number 7 could be confidential. We will never know. Policies to address concerns would need to be developed. At the moment, no such policies have been presented to the committee, beyond some reporting of individual instances being addressed through personal correspondence and conversation. All right, and then finally, last page. Concordia University, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor is a Lutheran higher education community committed to helping students develop in mind, body, and spirit for service to Christ in the church and the world. This text is centered towards the upper right corner of the page. Below that is a yellow banner that reads Concordia University, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor. And on the left side of the page, we see a grayscale photo of the Ann Arbor campus. That concludes me reading the report. All 32 pages of the public version. As I said before, I'd be really interested in the confidential section and everything that was redacted for this public report. If you have access to it, I would be really interested in it. My email is going to be in the description of this video. My final thoughts are Ann Arbor seems like it could be a great standalone campus if money was committed to developing the buildings, to revamping the buildings, and if they even had the budget in the first place to have all of the licensing and the staff needed for their own campus. They honestly sound like they're more successful than Concordia University, Wisconsin, at least just based off of this report. it's very sad to me that potential resources and funding that could be made available to Ann Arbor could all be judged solely off of the LIMOS standards of their campus. And I really, really dread to think that LIMOS could be, I'm not saying it is, but it could potentially become the inquisition arm of the LCMS, and the determining factor for any funding for any potential project, campus, and probably congregations in the future. Anyway, that is it for today. Please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this video. If you made it all the way to the end, props to you. And thank you for listening to it all the way through. I will see you in the next video. Thank you.